Board August meeting. Wait a few minutes for a few more board members to join us. Thank you.
Hey, David, how many board members are there? How large is this meeting?
This meeting has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 board members, plus OHA staff and the public.
Oh, very good.
All right. Morning, everyone. Looks like we have people assembled. Welcome to the August Oregon Health Policy Board meeting. I'm David Banksburg, Chair of the Board and Dean of the OHSU PSU School of Public Health. It's great to see you all. We have a full agenda today. Just a few housekeeping notes for the meeting. We are doing this via Zoom, and the meeting allows attendees to message the host, but not other meeting participants. If you have any questions during the meeting or subsequent to the meeting, you should send it to the host or email them to the board at healthpolicyboard@state.or.us. That's healthpolicyboard@state.or.us. Welcome again, everybody. Steph, Jeremy, will you do the roll call, please?
Yes, sure thing. Thank you. And I'll go through this so that people on the phone can hear. So Oscar Arana.
Present.
David Bangsberg.
Here.
Ebony Clark.
Present.
Jessica Gomez. Okay, we can come back to Jessica. Kirsten Isaacson.
Here.
Brenda Johnson.
Here.
Bill Kramer. And John Santa.
Here.
Okay, great. So if Jessica or Bill show up, we'll just make sure to let folks know.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Steph. The next order of business is to vote on the July minutes. I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the July minutes, please.
This is Ebony. I move to approve the July minutes.
Thank you.
This is Brenda. I'll second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All right. All in favor of approving the minutes? Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstain? Great. Looks like Bill joined us.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm a couple minutes late.
Okay, great to have you. Welcome. All right. Moving on. We have a couple updates, 2 updates from prior meetings. One is an update on the metrics and scoring committee's meeting, and the other is update on the public comments we received on wireless radiation last meeting. First, would like to have an update on the metrics and scoring discussion. Our liaison to metrics and scoring committee, John Santa, has a few updates to share on this committee's deliberations. You'll recall we spent the last couple of months considering the 2022 menu set for metrics and scoring. We've heard from several subject matter experts, partners, stakeholders, and the public regarding the July vote on the menu set. John is here to give us an update of that vote and what's next for the committee.
Thanks, David. Metrics and scoring met in July to finalize the decisions on the set of measures. 14 measures were eventually indicated or supported for 2022. That included the kindergarten readiness measure, which I think we've heard a lot about and supported. It included the tobacco prevention measure, which in a June decision had been taken off of the incented measures. And there's a robust discussion about that, and appreciate OHA and the public health folks having input into that discussion, and it was put back as a measure. There was also a robust discussion about an interesting mental health measure that, again, in June was taken off the incented measure. Again, I thought the Oregon Health Authority did a good job of supporting that being returned to the incented measures, but ultimately the committee did not support that. And so that measure will not be included in 2022. I understand there are options for mental health measures of this type and potentially others to be encouraged via some of the behavioral health strategies coming out of the legislature, so that's good. There was also discussion of returning screening for colorectal cancer, which had been removed a couple of years ago. And that also was not moved forward into the 2022 measure set. Lots of pros and cons of that. So overall, I think I was pleased that the kindergarten readiness measure and the tobacco measure were on the list, and we're ready to go to the next stage in terms of 2022, and hope that there'll be some discussion elsewhere about the mental health measures.
Thank you, John. Any comments or questions from the board? Well, just like to thank you, John, for helping contribute to those discussions and sharing the update with us. I think kindergarten readiness, I think, is one of the most innovative measures. Certainly is upstream, is community driven. Endorses the values of health equity that we all support. So I think that these measures are really moving in the right direction. And also appreciate that prevalence of cigarette smoking or tobacco use was still retained as a very important measure of lost life years. Any other comments or thoughts? Welcome, Jessica. Great to see you here.
Thank you so much.
All right. The other update we have is, as you remember last meeting, we had some significant public comment related to wireless radiation at the July meeting. We had both oral public testimony as well as written public testimony. We have taken that public testimony very seriously and deliberated over that public testimony over last month. And in partnership with OHA, we've drafted a public statement in response to the public testimony that was provided. And I would like to read that statement, which will be available on the website. The Oregon Health Policy Board values community engagement, welcomes public comment at its board meetings and on its agenda items. We want to thank you, our members of the public, for engaging in our meetings through written and verbal public comment. In response to public comment regarding radio frequency radiation during the July Oregon Health Policy Board meeting, I, the chair, read the OHA report. I then reviewed all the videotaped public comment or recorded public comment during the meeting, went back and read all the written materials submitted along with as public comment, and then went back and reread the OHA report with both the oral and written public comments in mind. My impressions, I got together with OHA and discussed my impressions with OHA Public Health Division. Senate Bill 283 identifies exposure from use of wireless network technologies in schools or similar environments as a primary concern, and directed OHA to evaluate peer-reviewed, independently funded scientific studies of the health effects of exposure to microwave radiation, also known as radio frequency radiation, or RFR. Senate Bill 283 directed OHA to concentrate on the review of the health effects in school or similar environments, but most of the studies available for review were largely unrelated to school settings. Nonetheless, OHA in its analysis included studies that overlap those expected in the school setting, with many estimating higher levels of exposure. As stated in the report, OHA found insufficient evidence to indicate a causal relationship between cell phone exposures and cancer, as well as non-cancer effects and functions such as auditory function, cognitive function, nervous system, miscarriage, reproductive system, sleep, and mental health. Most studies found no association between long-term use and these health effects and functions. OHA also recognizes that there are important limitations in the observed epidemiologic studies to date. The most important limitation is that these studies really had a poor assessment of the primary exposure of interest, radiofrequency radiation. This limitation, namely errors in the measurement of the primary exposure variable, can fail to detect a true association, often referred to in epidemiologic terms as a type 2 error. OHA also recognizes that data from animal studies provided additional, though inconclusive, evidence of potential harms of radiofrequency radiation. Taken together, animal and epidemiologic studies can give a better idea of the possible effects of RFR. However, the synthesis of these two lines of data would need to consider the relevance of the dose, the exposure mode, and what is known as the extrapolation of RFR-related health effects from animals to humans. While the available data do not prove a causal effect, neither do they exclude the possibility of a causal effect. OHA recognizes the many benefits of wireless technologies, including connecting remote communities in Oregon and supplementing education both during the COVID-19 pandemic and through remote learning and in the classroom. OHA strongly supports additional research designed to overcome these limitations in order to better define the possible benefits and harms of radiofrequency radiation in order to advance evidence-based policy. A focus of Senate Bill 283 is school environments, and the relevant exposure in these settings need to be considered. These conclusions on radiofrequency radiation exposures and effects of human health are aligned with those made by the USDA, the Centers for Disease Control, the National Cancer Institute, and other agencies who work to protect population health. Similar to those federal public agencies, OHA does not regulate cell phone or Wi-Fi technologies. OHA remains committed to ensuring the health of children and families and will look forward to future research coming from reputable sources to guide evidence-based policy. So for more information, you can view OHA's wireless technology risk report and the report FAQs related to wireless report and other resources on wireless technology on the Oregon Health Authority website. So once again, I would like to thank everybody who provided public comment. I would like to thank OHA for seriously engaging in this public comment, reflecting on this public comment, and coming to a statement which I feel very comfortable with and I think is very sound. I would like to welcome any questions or comments from the board regarding this statement. Questions, comments?
Sorry, had to unmute.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Good morning. It sounds like there's going to be additional investigation into this. Am I getting that correctly?
I don't think OHA is committed to doing this investigation itself. It's not a scientific research enterprise. I think OHA is committed to, following the scientific literature. And if scientific literature evolves that suggests a change in policy, I think the OHA would be very open to considering that. But I don't think there's no commitment to sponsor additional research or funding to support that at this time from OHA. Jeremy?
Oh, I think that's right. And this report came from, and I'll let Jonathan jump in here with more details. But I mean, this report came from a legislative request for us to review the evidence that was out there and summarize it.
David, I just want to thank you for all your time and attention to this matter, looking into these reports very thoroughly and spending so much time working with OHA and OHA leadership. I also want to thank OHA staff for all their attention to this matter and working on this. So thank you.
Appreciate that, Oscar. Yes. Appreciate especially OHA, all the team from the Public Health Division. We're very thoughtful in reflecting on the public comment, and I really appreciate that. All right. Any other comments? If not, we'll move on. We have a full packed agenda as usual today. I'm going to just like to review the things that we'll discuss. First, we'll hear from the Committee Membership Project on their work to explore the current state of committees of the board membership and propose recommendation how to improve and strengthen the membership of our committees leading with equity. We'll hear from the Cost Growth Target Program on its new advisory committee slated to take over when the current implementation committee sunsets this December. We'll have public comments and then take a break. Pat Allen has a conflict this morning, will join us after the break for his update. And then the second half of the meeting will be dedicated to diving more into the waivers, health equity work, and the new emerging comments. So we look forward to these discussions. So we'll start with committee membership work group findings, draft findings and recommendations. Last fall, the Oregon Health Policy Board asked OHA to consider its committee's membership and identify recommendations on how we can improve inclusion and equity inclusion among committee board membership. A few weeks ago, we had a project update at the July 13th educational webinar, and today we're joined by project sponsor and team to hear greater details about these findings and recommendations and the next step of this work. Copy of the project report, which is very detailed, is in your packet and also available on the web. I'd like to welcome Director Leanne Johnson, Director of the Division of Equity Inclusion and project sponsor, who will do us the honor of introducing this work and the importance of this work. Director Johnson, please.
Thank you, Chair Bangsberg, and hello to you and members of the Oregon Health Policy Board. My name is Leanne Johnson. I'm the Director of the Equity and Inclusion Division for the Oregon Health Authority, and a special welcome to new members whom I've not had the opportunity to meet directly. So very pleased to see this board just expanding and shaping up here. Thank you. So I wanted to speak with you briefly as one of the co-executive sponsors. The other executive sponsor is Don Jagger, our Chief of Staff for the Oregon Health Authority, who could not be here today. So I'm here on behalf of the both of us, as well as this work that we've been doing. And thank you very much to the board for the direction to better not only diversify, but really look at how we distribute and redistribute power in our decision-making throughout our work and throughout the state. So as you all know, we as an agency have been doing work to intentionally shift our work to identify and remove structural racism and barriers, as well as barriers of racism and oppression in our decision-making. And as many of us know, this extends back 529 years when these lands were first colonized, and we became, many of us became subjected to supremacy. And in that process, power was diminished by many people towards specific groups of people in this country. So we have a lot that we are doing. There's a lot that we are undoing, let's put it that way. And this is just one very small step in that larger process to be more equitable in the work we're doing as the Oregon Health Authority. Some of you may also know that the Oregon Health Authority leadership team, we've been working diligently over the last 2 years in anti-racism work. And this work is difficult. And so when we talk about exploring the exploration of diversifying boards, which is not enough because representation is not enough, we've got to really look at how we redistribute the power that exists within those, those entities. And we, as an Oregon Health Authority leadership, have been in deep conversation about the resistance to anti-racism, the resistance to that redistribution, and working to understand not only how we become the vehicles of that change, but how do we support people throughout that process who have experienced over time, over 529 years, predominantly Black and Brown people, how do we provide space for people to heal in that process, for all of us to heal. So this is not a one-dimensional process, it's a multidimensional process. It's not a transactional process, it's a transformational one. And we're really working to align through this work of the committee membership team, work to align with our strategic goal to eliminate health inequities by 2030. We are working to better center equity and exploring ways that many facets of boards and committee membership can support or hinder equitable participation and representation in our membership slates. Once again, understanding that representation is not enough. Equity is even not enough. And we know that equity is a bold value and bold move. We've got to understand also in this that it doesn't serve the process or serve people well to bring people into settings and then not provide, or not provide isn't even the right word, not have a system that truly is looking at how we decolonize that 529 years, how people have the opportunity not only to liberate themselves, but create liberated spaces for all. And so this work will absolutely, it's beginning stages. It will fall short of that. We all are falling short of that, but we are determined to make a difference. This work is just a start, and we are working to prioritize not only the diversification, but the retention of boards, and the fact that we've got to look at the power structure within, and we've got to look at how these spaces become liberated spaces so that all people truly can participate and bring the wisdom of community that will get us to that 10-year goal, that will get us to achieving health equity across the board in the system. I will stop there. I will turn it over to two of my colleagues, Susan Otter and Ignatius Bao. I am pleased to have them here on behalf of the executive sponsors to present the work today. And I thank you very much again for the push that you provided to move our agency toward this reflection and toward what I'm hoping will be a deep and lasting change in our work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. My name is Susan Otter. I'm the Director of Health Information Technology for the Oregon Health Authority and lead staff for the committee membership project. And today, let's move to the next slide. I'm joined by Ignatius Bao, who's our contracted project lead for this work. So today we're going to recap the project background. Ignatius will walk through the draft findings and draft recommendations. We'd love your feedback on those, and we'll interrupt as we go to ask clarifying and technical questions. We'll pause periodically to see if there's any questions, and then have discussion at the end. But please interrupt us as we go. At the end, we'll go through the next steps. We have a second phase envisioned for this work and some more of Ignatius Bao's time. And so we really want to hear from you. Is this work directionally correct? Is there anything missing from the draft findings? How did we do with our recommendations in addressing those findings? And are we moving in the right direction for the next steps? Again, the draft report that you have in your packet is preliminary. We will be updating and finalizing that report after the next phase of work and coming back in October with the final work. So If you have feedback outside of this meeting, please send that to staff. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a recap of the project background. Next slide. We went through in more detail, as Dr. Bangsberg mentioned, the environmental scan and a considerable amount of the work in the July 13th educational webinar. So this will be a very brief background, and then we'll jump into the findings and recommendations and next steps. So as Leanne eloquently mentioned, we've prioritized health equity. This work is rooted in that priority and the definition of health equity that's been adopted by OHA and the policy board, and is one of the 4 policy board priorities for this biennium, is to center work on health equity. Next slide. Just as a grounding, the policy board has 9 committees, soon to add a couple more that came out of the legislative session. The background and work that we've done for this report and presentation today focused on the 9 existing committees, but just know that this is not, this diagram will be changing. Across the work of the policy board, it's important work. You rely on your committees for the success of the board's work. And so ensuring that we have excellent membership and processes and inclusive processes on those committees is a core value and importance for this for us to achieve our goals. So this slide also shows where members of these committees are appointed. So we have the board and 3 committees are appointed by the governor, and those are in blue. The policy board appoints the members to 4 committees, and those are in yellow. And then OHA appoints members to 2 committees in red. There are 165 membership positions across the board and its 9 committees. Currently, about 130 members are filling those positions. And that kind of membership number shifts as we go. All right, next slide. So the work of the committee membership project was really spearheaded after a presentation to the board in September of last year, where the board decided not to approve a proposed committee membership slate due to lack of racial and ethnic representation. In October, the staff came back and proposed that the board charge OHA to engage more deeply in this work. And in the charter for that work, I think this problem statement really sets the framing well. The policy board and its committees are important decision-making and advisory bodies that need more member representation with expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion, representation from communities experiencing health inequities, members who can contribute the unique knowledge of lived experience from underrepresented communities, and allies with the willingness to learn and take meaningful action to break down barriers to achieving health equity. Next slide. The board charged the work group with a number of things to inform and develop a process to ensure diverse and equity-focused committee membership, to provide guidance on best practices for committee recruitment and retention, and recommendations for systemic changes to support diverse and equity-focused committee membership. The committee membership project started in earnest in December and January. We started with developing provisional guidelines for those committees that needed to recruit members before the report was complete. We were able to bring on our external contractor, Ignatius Bow, in April, who conducted root cause and gap analyses, environmental scan, and interviews with internal and external stakeholders, which led to the development of the draft report. In conjunction, this work was completed in conjunction with the OHA executive sponsors and 4 sponsors from the policy board. So we want to thank your time for that. That's Oscar, John, Ebony, and Brenda. So thank you so much for your time so far. We'll be tapping you further for the next phase of this work. We had a internal committee membership work group with great cross collaboration internally across OHA in terms of the members of that group who have supported and conducted some of this work as well. We look forward to the next phase and want to get your feedback on that at the end of this presentation on what we propose our next steps will be from through October to complete this report and start the implementation of some of the key points that we think are important. So if you can go to the next slide. So in our July 13th educational webinar, we went in more detail into the root cause analysis and gap analysis and the background. I wanted to highlight just a couple things today before turning it over to Ignatius. So when we look at the policy board and its committees, we have the most comprehensive data for race and ethnicity, sex and geography. However, data are not uniformly collected. Not all committees have collected data in other areas such as primary language, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And only the Health Equity Committee collects data about expertise in equity and lived experience, and no committee collects data about age. So as we think about our goals and the need to increase members on committees that have experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion, we actually don't know the current status of current members and their level of expertise and have a difficult time really summing up the demographic data because it's not collected uniformly. Staff did an analysis that was presented in October of 2020 to the board on the current committee's members and the diversity based on the data we have collected. That's included in the appendix of the report. Here we're just displaying the race ethnicity data for committees that compare in blue committee members to in gray the Oregon census for race and ethnicity. And you can see that in some areas we have greater representation across committee members in some categories, and in some we have less. So for more information on the race, ethnicity, and disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, geography, and sex breakdown, that you can refer to the report. Next slide. The other analysis that we've completed is preliminary analysis looking at the seats, so statutorily designated membership seats by category, and then the sectors that current members are in. So when we talk about seats, we have 6 committees that have very specific statute requiring specific seats for specific types of representatives. So this analysis in the table is new. We didn't have this for the July 13th educational webinar, so I wanted to make sure to share that with you today. So there are about 45% of seats are statutorily designated. If you remember, we have about 165 seats across the board and its 9 committees. As I mentioned, 6 of the committees have statutory requirements for specific seats, and the majority of those are in hospital, health systems, providers, and payers and state agencies seats. Some of our state agency seats are non-voting. You can also see we have representation across public health, consumer, healthcare analysis, advisory bodies, employers, tribes, and CMS, and then there's miscellaneous other seats as well. So one of the things that we have been looking at as part of the charter for this work is, are there statutory or charter changes that might be needed to achieve the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion for our committees? So this is some analysis to inform that. We also did analysis that was presented in the July 13th webinar on our current members and what sectors they represent. So as I mentioned, we have about 130 members filling those 165 seats. And we found that payers and providers make up nearly half of current members. Consumer, tribal, and other groups have low representation, and some organizations have multiple members on different committees, so may be overrepresented. And that full analysis is in the report as well. I wanted to just pause here, especially since this is new analysis, and see if anyone had any questions from the board or comments.
This is Ebony. I have a quick question. So, as I think about the specific populations that, we serve and that utilize and rely on our continuum of care that's public facing, again, always, I think the priority is always to also make sure that there's equal representation from the consumers. And, so thinking about kind of lived experience, the one question that I have is, and it may be in the report and I might have just missed it, is, also I know that there's lived experience around those that touch the criminal justice system. And so I don't know if that was a data point that was looked at or considered.
Ultimately, what we found was that we didn't have sufficient information on lived experience. It's not a question that's typically asked of applicants or committee members in most committees. And we also lacked complete information on sector and some of these other pieces. As we mentioned earlier, we don't have consistent demographic information or collected in consistent ways. So ultimately, one of our recommendations you'll see is that we develop a common template that includes consistent questions and that we do gather that baseline data from our existing committees. And that's something that we'll want your input on and hope to develop for the October meeting. But we do have some recommendations around that. And I appreciate the calling out the criminal justice system as a component of lived experience. That's not something that we've asked.
Susan, I think Kirsten had a comment or question.
I had just a clarifying question. Thanks for this work, Susan and Ignatius and everybody. I think I don't know, being unimaginative this morning or something. When you say advisory body representation, can you give an example of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me see if I can find that. It includes the policy board. So it's committee, advisory. So in one setting, it is the policy board. So, or it could be another committee, for example. So saying we need a member on our committee that's also representing another advisory board.
Susan, I have a question, and it's going to be kind of a in the weeds question, but this will help me sort of as I get more context. So feel free to just either give me like estimates, or maybe you actually might know the answer, or you can follow up later. But that statement about the 45% of seats are statutorily designated.
Yeah.
Can you, what is our percentage, in terms of like actually, are we like 97% sort of those seats are 97% filled, or are we like 80% filled within that 45%? Like how good are we at like the statutorily designated seats?
I don't have that at my fingertips, but we can get that information and bring that back to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, Bill has his hand up.
Great.
Hi, Susan, a question. Maybe this is in the report and I missed it. Just a question about how representatives of labor organizations are categorized in this analysis on the table you're showing here, or in that other analysis that you described.
And when you say labor organizations, you mean like SEIU, that
right.
kind of, that's a good question.
So I can jump in, Susan. I think labor is included in the other seats. There might be just one seat that's designated for organized labor.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, let's move to the next slide and I will turn it over to Ignatius.
Great, thank you, Susan. I'm really excited to present some of the findings and recommendations that we're initially making, and obviously welcoming your feedback and input as we continue to refine this work. So if we go to the next slide. So similar to the overview that Leanne just provided us, if we think about what are the root causes of the lack of racial and ethnic representation and diversity among committees, we really have to go back to that history of over 500 years of racism and structural inequities against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so that has continued through our history. It certainly continues to show up in the lack of representation or outright exclusion of BIPOC and American Indian people in health professions and other fields that we're going to be drawing from for committee members. And so when we usually have this analysis at the last two rows of there aren't enough candidates or applicants to choose from, and therefore there's a lack of diversity, I think it's important for us to recognize this broader context that not only impacts the specific membership of the committees, but really how Oregon Health Authority as a whole is going to approach this work. Again, this is part of this broader strategy of really shifting that power and resources back to those communities that have been so disproportionately impacted and who are continue to be the primary focus of many of OHA's programs. So given that systematic analysis, we then go to next. This analysis, again, that Leanne mentioned on the next slide, where the focus of this work is really on the diversity of these committees and a little bit towards what inclusive practices might be. But we know that diversity, and especially a tokenized view of diversity that simply looks at numbers, isn't enough. That we want those numbers to increase in terms of the representation from various communities and populations that have been underrepresented. But we also ultimately want more inclusive practices and ultimately inclusive policies and equitable policies that come out of these committees, that it's the product, the work that the committees do. It's not just who's sitting around the table, but what the committees ultimately are able to accomplish. And to the extent that those committee products and processes and policies support the overall goal of the Oregon Health Authority to prioritize health equity and ultimately achieve health equity. Next slide. So much of what we have done in these months of more intensive work has been focusing on the racial and ethnic diversity. We recognize that individuals and communities have multiple and intersecting identities, and are conscious that we have to do some additional work in this next phase of work around people who speak languages other than English, immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ plus individuals, individuals with disabilities. And now that we've added age to the diversity definition, thinking about youth, seniors, and elders as another dimension of diversity. And so while this analysis may apply to some of these other populations and communities, we're also conscious that we have to do more work to flesh this all out before we bring you the final findings and recommendations. Next. So as you have probably figured out, this is a very complex puzzle of different committees, different requirements, different processes. The data collection has not been, unfortunately, consistent or comprehensive. And so part of our findings is that there's just this lack of centralization and coordination and alignment. We may not need complete centralization, but at least we need alignment. And so one clear finding is that there isn't a consistent way to collect this data from applicants, even in the screening process of who we're considering. And so again, making sure that that's at least a little more standardized and aligned will help us get this picture that goes across all 9 committees. And then finally, a real finding that I think is helpful to staff who feel a lot of pressure, especially those that lead committees to meet these goals of diversity, that there isn't this sense and structure and support for them to work together across committees. And so again, really thinking of this as a system and not just a committee by committee, a transactional matter where there's a vacancy and how do I fill it, but really looking again constantly as the whole across all the committees across all of OHA. Next slide. So Susan already talked about this, and we're not going to dwell as much upon this. What we do want to call out is that we want to collect more experience about lived and what we're calling cross-cultural experience. Next slide. So we're proposing these definitions where, next slide, lived experience would be based on, if you go back one, how someone identifies. So I could identify as an Asian American, but there's more to my identity as an Asian American. Am I connected to the Asian American community? Am I active in the Asian American community? Am I knowledgeable about the issues and concerns and priorities of the community? So again, even asking someone to self-identify along one of the dimensions of diversity is not enough. We want to probe a little bit deeper and develop some questions that would get at one's actual knowledge, experience, and ability to reflect the needs and priorities of that and assets of that particular community or population. Similarly, we also want to recognize that, again, as an Asian American, I've worked in many other immigrant and refugee communities. I've worked in African American and Black communities. And so I may have lived experience working in other communities that I can also bring to bear. But again, unless I'm asked about that and asked to share what that experience has been, that's not necessarily going to be known or automatically, and we certainly shouldn't assume it. So it could be professional experience, it could be personal or volunteer experience, it could be family experience that is, again, different than one's own identity that's reported. And so we're suggesting that we use this experience as subject matter expertise that is valued and recognized. And so again, not only asking about it, but again, bringing that fully into the committee process and into the committee work. Next slide. So from the other, I think, important thing when we're talking about this from a system point of view and a transformational point of view, rather than a transactional point of view, is also to have the perspective of the communities, that this is unfortunately not all about OHA and not all about the Oregon Health Policy Board and its committees. And so when we asked community members and stakeholders externally, what's important to you, many said it might not be these committees, that there are a number of other committees. We count over 200 Oregon Health Authority committees alone, let alone all the other boards and commissions that the governor appoints, that there are other departments and agencies in the Oregon state government have. So those may be more priorities. It could be criminal justice, it could be transportation, it could be education. It could be other parts of health that aren't specifically limited to the Oregon Health Policy Board. And so really recognizing that community members are also picking and choosing and prioritizing is also an important recognition. And then how then, if we are going to succeed in recruiting and retaining more diverse members from the community that represent some of those populations, then how do we make sure that there are processes in place to support their engagement and participation on the committees and their retention. And we're going to get into some of those recommendations later about supports for those committee members moving forward. Next slide. And so included in here is not only processes, but really no analysis of why committee members are not active and engaged or retained. And this is going to involve not only supports, but also some training that includes training for not just committee staff, OHA staff, but also committee leadership, chairs and vice chairs of committees, of how they, as they run and chair those meetings of those committees, make sure that all members are engaged. And again, these perspectives, subject matter expertise of lived experience and cross-cultural experience are recognized and lifted up. So let me stop there and see if there's any comments from the board about these initial findings, anything missing from these findings, any questions about what I just presented as findings.
John has had a hand up.
Yeah, terrific stuff. As I'll mention later, I think one area that might be interesting to look at is analyze as a group, what are the chairs of the committees as a group, as a population look like? Where do they come from? I mean, the chairs are the most powerful folks on those committees. And I think making more of an effort to transfer power by making sure that chairs are selected by the kinds of things you're talking about would be worthwhile.
Great, thanks for that suggestion. Other comments or questions from the board members?
Just a really quick comment. I totally acknowledge and agree with, the fact that there's a lot of demands on community members, consumers, and sort of that target population that we're trying to bring into these committees, and that they're being asked to sit on multiple boards and so many committees, and they're just, being asked to do lots of different things. And yes, I agree that there's a lot of interest too, right? Like there's so many different priorities, education, like housing. There's lots of different priorities for folks when they're making decisions about where they're going to be spending their time and where they're going to be sort of putting forth their energy. And, that's why it's even more important for these committees to be inclusive and welcoming, because we need that kind of environment for folks to then choose to be part of, health and health equity and the health system. They need to see the connection between the health system and how it affects everything, right? Housing, education, all of those things. So it's really important to be able to create an environment where folks feel supported and welcomed, and where their voice and their input feels valued.
Great, thank you for that comment. And when we get to the recommendations, we're going to be making some recommendations both on capacity building to help communities be more supportive in potential engagement, but also making some recommendations around other ways that committees could reach out to those committees and get input and engagement from them. So I see Bill Kramer and Jessica Gomez.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Ignatius and the team for putting together this really important report. This is a very challenging issue, and appreciate how difficult it is and all the efforts need to go into doing making sure that both organizations and interests and categories that there's appropriate representation in all these committees. My experience in this has indicated that folks who are not in the healthcare industry, who are not full-time working for a hospital or a health insurer or a physician group, have a very difficult time finding the time and getting the support they need to participate effectively. And I think that's what I'm hearing you're saying. I think maybe you'll be getting this in the more detailed recommendations, but I'd be interested in your hearing a little bit more about your findings about that, and maybe if there are recommendations we can we can save it for that part. But I think this is a particularly difficult thing, particularly since a lot of these committees, you're supposed to have expertise in a particular area. And folks who it's not, if their full-time job is not in healthcare, they're often overwhelmed by the expertise that are brought by folks who do work full-time in healthcare and can toss around terms like, MLR and, clinical issues and so on very easily, and because it's part of their language. But folks for whom this is not their full-time job, they're quickly overwhelmed, intimidated, and less likely to participate effectively. So there's really a need for this kind of support. So maybe you could, I don't know if you want to say more now about findings or save it for the recommendation section, but just want to highlight that issue.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the recommendations. So Jessica Gomez.
Yeah, I just, I think this is good. I don't want to also lose sight of the competency piece, because we can, try to fill commissions and committees with people that fit these profiles, but if they don't have core competency that adds to the work of the board, we've got a different kind of issue. So I just want to make sure that we're not selecting people based on their heritage, skin color, hair color, eyes, whatever, and where they sit in the healthcare system without considering the core competency that you actually need to have in order to truly bring that perspective in a way that is meaningful to the board. So I don't know how this is kind of going to overlay on top of some of the other things that are being considered when board members or potential board members or committee members apply or are selected. But I just don't want to I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that.
Right, and similar to the comment that Bill Kramer just made, I think we also want to find ways to elevate the perspective of consumers, the perspective of diverse communities as expertise, that as competency as well, and put it on an equal footing with some of the other expertise that is really required in the competencies that are required for the committees. So I see Brenda Johnson and Ebony Clark.
Thanks, Ignatius. You actually just spoke to my comment. I think it's really critical that we continue to redefine the question of competency to the notion of lived experience and cross-cultural experiences being equal to, if not more important than what we traditionally think of as competency. So thanks for that.
And Ebony Clark.
Yeah, you already responded, but I just want to say, to me, I think it's a both and, just because oftentimes, and I'm just going to say it, oftentimes what we see in bureaucracy and within our healthcare system are policymakers and or our professionals and providers that are sitting around the table making the decisions on and on and on without equal voice and perspective of those that are utilizing services. And then on the flip side, we continue to be dissatisfied with the outcomes, but yet we still then sit around the table as policymakers, bureaucrats, providers, and professionals. And so I think that it is important that we continue to, undo the roots of colonization and systemic racism. And so to me, I think it's a both and, because I believe also that individuals hold the expertise and solutions to what they need, and our jobs as professionals and providers are to just be there to assist and support those individuals. And you can hear that I have my behavioral health clinical hat on, so thanks.
Thank you, and hopefully you'll see some of that reflected as we go to the recommendations. So let me go to those recommendations. Next slide. Again, these are draft. We will continue to work on these as we gather more information, hear your feedback, incorporate your feedback over the next few months. So first is we do need standardized definitions. And so we are working on a template to collect that data from both existing members as well as future applicants that will be, again, standardized across the committees, that will include questions about lived experiences and cross-cultural experiences, and also specific questions about health equity and racial equity, again, elevating the competencies and the subject matter expertise on those issues. We recognize that we have to explain this, of why this is important, and how the data will be used to hold the committees, to hold OHA as a whole accountable. So what is going to be publicly shared and reported, and how is that going to be done, to share that with members and applicants, as well as the committees themselves. Educational process, as John Santa said, within the committees, within the chairs particularly, on why this is important to have this data and have it publicly available. Next slide. The next recommendations is that we then are going to propose processes that are more systematic, that are not committee by committee, that include, for example, a more standardized description similar to the quarterly update that Tara now prepares about the work of the committees, taking a page from what the governor's office does, which is an annual listing of upcoming vacancies. So as we know that members are cycling off or terming off, that we have some notice ahead of time, so we're not working on filling those vacancies at the last minute, but that we have as much lead time as we can. We need some sort of coordination, whether it's a database, some sort of information sharing about these external relationships that are going to be so critical in identifying candidates and applicants. And so here, Oscar Arana, are some recommendations of potentially some capacity building strategies, particularly with philanthropy that is already invested in many of these communities and these organizations. Next. We also are going to be looking at that puzzle of what is statutorily required or now required by charters that OHA or the policy board controls, and whether or not, for example, we should explicitly add expertise and experience in health equity or racial equity as a qualification for committee members. Adding consumer seats to committees that don't have them, or expanding the number of consumer seats as a potential change. And then obviously there is a little bit of zero sum here, so that if we see overrepresentation from particular sectors or organizations, then part of that shift of power and resources might be eliminating or reducing some of those seats from those overrepresented sectors or constituencies. The next recommendation, next slide. So diversity of who the members are is not enough. And so we are conscious that we also have to work on the retention and engagement. And so clearly processes, including some best practices that many of the external stakeholders shared from their own experiences of mentoring, check-ins, debriefings with committee members. So again, really supporting committee members. To Bill Kramer's point, how do we really provide that additional support and assistance to committee members that may get lost in some of the technical conversation, to bring them up to speed and make sure that they're participating, and then working with other processes as well to make sure that there's always engagement by the diverse members of the committees. And next slide. So here also is back to the two-way process of it's also finding other ways that committee membership is one really, really critical strategy and way of getting to diversity, inclusion, and equity. But there are many other ways that committees could engage with committees and learn about communities and really invite communities into a relationship. And so making sure that the how of committees is whether it's the venue, interpretation, access for people who are disabled. We'll develop these recommendations more as we go further. And then even just the committee process of how votes and decisions are made may be something to look at. Next slide. And then continuing that two-way process, that other than having people sit around the table, committees could go out and proactively engage communities that have been underrepresented and excluded and not particularly heard from, and really asking them what their priorities are rather than asking communities to come speak to committee priorities, and really, again, having a more of a humble approach of learning and engaging rather than, again, simply asking communities to participate in what the committees have already decided or prioritized. And obviously public comments are a really important part of that process as well. And then final recommendation, all this will need support, resources and training. And so we're going to also be looking at, next slide, ways in which we can develop materials for both staff and committee leadership to make sure that these processes are doing what they're intended to do. And in the spirit of continuous improvement and quality assurance, getting feedback from committee members as well as community stakeholders about whether or not these processes, these changes are actually making an impact and making a difference. So let me stop there and see if there's additional comments or questions about the recommendations before we go to next steps. John Santa, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. As I mentioned a bit earlier, I think you should think about a recommendation related to chairs. I was involved in a national process many years ago around clinical guidelines. And the committee I was on recommended for specialty societies that they have a primary care doctor chair their committee, because the concern about bias on the part of specialists was so high. And so many of the issues I'm hearing was, there in a different context. And the American College of Cardiology did that. And I think it was successful. I haven't checked back in. But I think saying something specifically about chairs.
Great, thank
then
you.
The other is messy. But when it comes to wealth, wealthy health stakeholders are superb at influencing power through their wealth, through gifts, through consultancies, through a variety of strategies. And I don't know if this is the place to deal with that. It's really tricky, it's really messy, but it happens all the time. And it's so sad when a committee realizes that they have had a member who is compromised and they didn't know it.
And thank you for that. And obviously tackling that is messy and challenging. And again, some of the recommendations are, rather than waiting for people to come to the committee, that committees could actually be more proactive in going out to communities and not, again, just waiting, for example, for public comments, but really engaging and learning about the needs and the priorities and the assets of diverse, excluded and underrepresented communities and populations ahead of time. Other comments or questions?
Ignatius, I just love all the recommendations. I think they're all so important, and they're all sort of supporting each other. Like, it's almost like you can't just do one without the others, because then it won't be effective. Like, you need all of them to have a high level of importance and priority and resources. And I would also say that I'm this recommendation about changes to statutes and charters seems like, for me, like really powerful, right? I think we just, from the earlier slides, we saw that nearly half of the committee seats are filled by folks that are there based on statute, right? So for me, there's this real opportunity here about flipping that statutory requirement and sort of placing that statutory requirement around folks who have health equity policy experience, folks who bring lived experience, cross-cultural experience. You know, as we move forward through this process, I would love to explore that and figure out how we can make that change.
Thank you for that. And again, back to Leanne's initial framing, if this is going to be more than just transactional, changing numbers and really changing systems, then that kind of bold transformational kind of change is what is needed. And we will include those recommendations. And then it's going to take a lot of work to actually implement and follow through if that's where the board and OHA goes. Other comments or questions?
Nisha, we should probably keep going. We're good.
All right, so let me turn it back to Susan to talk about next steps.
Great. Let's go to the next slide. And next one. So the next steps, the committee membership work group and Ignatius will continue our work through October. We'll be incorporating the policy board and OHA feedback. Ignatius will be interviewing additional external stakeholders to address other dimensions of diversity. And we'll be developing our implementation plan. We'll be presenting the final findings and recommendations and implementation plan at the October policy board meeting and consulting with the sponsors ahead of that time. Ignatius, do you want to walk through the implementation plan components?
Sure. So as I've mentioned, we've already have a first draft of a template for data collection, both demographic data and sector data, lived experience on health equity and racial equity. We'll propose a more systematic process for recruitment and retention, guidance for staff and committee leadership on inclusive practices, including some proposals for training and what resources will be needed for that. To Oscar Arana's comment, some recommendations for potential statutory or charter changes. And then finally, conscious that we need to continue to communicate both internally and externally about all this and why it's important and why the board and OHA are doing this. And so communications tools and a plan as well.
Next, okay, let's move to the next slide. So just to mention the template in more detail for demographic and sector data, as Ignatius mentioned, we as staff have developed a draft. We'll be working internally to flesh that out and then work with our OHA and policy board sponsors to really get that draft template for collecting demographic and sector data in a good place. As well as clear communications about the purpose and use of the data. So we hope to present that final proposed template to the policy board as part of the October presentation. If the policy board adopts that template, we'll then work with committees to discuss and collect baseline data across all of our current members so that we have consistent and comparable data, and then share that back to the policy board at the February retreat. And you can see here the list of sections in the template that we are currently anticipating, but we have a lot more work to do with our sponsors. Next slide. So I think we are wrapping up. I guess, Ignatius, I'll turn it back to you if there are any other comments or questions on our next steps.
So any final comments or questions from the board?
I would really like to thank and compliment you all for taking a consideration that was raised in deliberations of the board very seriously, and not only taking it seriously, the seriousness of your response is really well evidenced in the detail of the report. Very much appreciate the careful documentation of stakeholder input. Going through that, I found it extremely informative and is a great document to guide our deliberations committee selection going forward. So, I mean, really, once again, appreciate the thorough, complete, and very serious response of OHA and your team based upon some discussions and concerns raised by this board.
Thank you.
Yeah, similar comments from me. To answer some of the questions in this slide, I would say, yes, it's directionally correct. One of the things I would love to see as we move forward in this process is more of the logistical sort of like, where does this live? How many staff members will it take? How is this structured? I mean, I know that this will require quite a bit of intention, dedicated staff members, dedicated resources moving forward beyond the completion of this report, right? Like I want to know who will be overseeing this, who will be leading this. So I'd love to as we move forward, those are some of the questions that I would love to also see included.
Thanks, Oscar, and thanks, team. This is Brenda. I have similar reflections. This is extraordinary body of work, and I too am longing for that next level of detail where we look at measurable by whens, dates and accountabilities, both for our committees and for our board, so that we really track progress on this extraordinary body of work. So thank you for today, and I look forward to next steps significantly now.
Any final comments or questions? Thank you all, and we will look forward to presenting our final recommendations and findings and these follow-up steps to all of you in October.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Pat has joined us, and I want to check in with Pat to see, Director Pat Allen, see if he would like to give his update before the cost growth target presentation. Pat?
He may have had to step away. I was worried that we have him slated for 10:30, and I was worried that he actually has something else pop up, but we'll check him back with him offline. We can take a break if we need.
All right, so we should keep on going with the.
Yeah, we can keep going.
All right. So next we have a presentation on cost growth target. The cost growth target program staff and the OHPB liaison will share details about the new advisory committee and is looking for policy board feedback on its proposed charge, the membership, and the recruitment plan. The draft advisory committee charter is in today's presentation and are included in the meeting packets number 3 and number 3.0, 3.1. So Jeremy, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. And I'll kick us off and then turn it over to Sarah here in a minute. Why don't we go to the next slide? Just a refresher to folks, the implementation committee, the 18-person implementation committee was established as part of Senate Bill 889 and sunsets at the end of this year. And the original committee was appointed by the governor. It's a committee of the policy board, but appointed by the governor and like several other committees that we talked about. The membership is laid out in statute pretty broadly, and the types of folks that need to be in certain seats on the committee. The committee that's in the bill sunsets at the end of the year, but the committee recommended that a successor committee be appointed and live on, and that group would have a variety of tasks, keeping track of the overall program, but also being advisory to the health policy board and to the agency on what's happening with healthcare costs as we're implementing the program and getting into things like the annual cycle of cost growth hearings and the annual report to the legislature. So what we really want to do with you today is to talk about the charter for that group, what the successor committee should look like so that we can begin recruitment and have that group live in January after the current committee sunsets. And to be clear, we'll invite folks that are currently on the committee to apply, but also want to take a step back and revisit membership and the charter overall, and make sure that we've got the right mix of folks as we go into implementation. We go to the next slide. So today I want to review the draft charter. We've reviewed this with the implementation committee at their last meeting, I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago. Want to review the charge for the committee, the membership, and then talk about recruitment. So I want to make sure that directionally we've got this head in the right direction. So like I said, the goal would be incorporate feedback that we've got from you all, and then have some work cut out for us the rest of this year to be doing recruitment. So let me turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Before we jump into the details, I just want to recognize all of the work that Susan and Ignatius presented in the last agenda item, and recognize that our proposal here and looking to stand up this new advisory committee is a little bit offset from the timing of that committee and policy board membership work. And so we've been consulting with Ignatius and the work group that's been working on those recommendations. We've modified, or what we're presenting today is informed by some of those recommendations, but also recognizing that work, those are still preliminary findings and recommendations, and they're not quite final yet. So I think one place where we might be looking for some board feedback is how to balance these two bodies of work. We really do want to establish this new committee, tentatively named the Advisory Committee. Please feel free to weigh in on the name as well, but without losing momentum for the cost growth target program. So we don't want to completely put everything on hold and delay recruitment and delay launching this new committee, but also recognizing that these recommendations and findings are in development, and we don't want to be too far ahead of that or do anything that would be contradictory to those recommendations. So just recognizing that for your feedback today. So I'm going to jump right into a couple of the pieces of the charter for what we're thinking for this advisory committee. So the first piece is the proposed charge, and this is what we think the new advisory committee would be responsible for. The advisory committee would be established under the direction of the policy board, and would be responsible for reviewing and understanding cost growth trends and cost growth drivers, identifying and addressing opportunities to reduce cost growth. So currently the implementation committee has really prioritized and started some focus on the value-based payment compact, and that spun off into a strategy. We know that the new committee will be focusing on identifying other opportunities and continuing to recommend strategies or policies and monitoring that. So they would also keep an eye on how we're doing towards those value-based payment goals, as well as any other initiatives that come out of the work. They would be exploring opportunities to improve equity as it relates to the cost growth target program and some of the negative impacts that we've discussed before. They would oversee ongoing program implementation. They would inform the annual public hearings. And one very specific charge that came out of the implementation committee work is revisiting the cost growth target value. So the implementation committee initially set the cost growth target at 3.4% for the first 5 years, dropping down to 3.0% for the second 5 years, with an asterisk that a future committee should review all of the economic indicators and confirm that change, that drop to 3.4% is still appropriate, as well as setting target for, say, the next 5 years after that. So those are some very specific things that the new advisory committee would do. And one question that came up both with the implementation committee and in some back and forth with you all, some of you individually and some other stakeholders, is will this advisory committee be responsible or be the decision makers in terms of holding a payer or a provider organization responsible or accountable for their cost growth target performance? Would this advisory committee be the one that says, yes, you get a performance improvement plan. Yes, you are going to be issued a financial penalty for failure to meet the cost growth target. And I want to be really clear that this advisory committee would not have that responsibility. They do not oversee accountability. They would be updated on how we're doing as a state. They would have information about that. They would be able to ask questions, but they would not be the decision makers about when accountability is applied. And I think that might address some of the potential concerns about conflict of interest when we talk about proposed membership in a few minutes. So that is the proposed charge. There is no specific deliverable, unlike the implementation committee that had specific recommendations it was supposed to come up with by a certain date and report back to the board and the legislature. We do not currently have any deliverables for the advisory committee other than oversight of the program. That doesn't mean that OHA, DCBS, and or the policy board couldn't change those responsibilities or request deliverables over time as needed. So in terms of proposed membership, we are proposing that the advisory committee members will serve 2-year terms, and that initially will stagger to ensure continuity so that we don't have a brand new committee that completely replaces in 2 years. I think this also ties back to what Ignatius was talking about with the continuity and the capacity building and ensuring that we're continuing to build and recruit that bench, as well as have smooth transitions on and off of committees. The advisory committee members would be appointed by you, the policy board. We would like to do an open recruitment process this fall, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And we would ask the advisory committee members to fulfill their responsibilities, and that's all described in the charter in more detail than what I am covering in the slides. Next slide, please. So when we think about the proposed membership for this committee, we had a couple of inputs. One was the original legislative language in Senate Bill 889, which identified some of those specific statutory seats. We also have what the current composition of the implementation committee looks like, because that shifted a little bit over the almost 2 years that committee's been around now. We had some feedback from the implementation committee when we presented this proposal to them last week, and that's been incorporated in what we're talking about today. We also had some consultation with Ignatius and the committee membership work group and those preliminary recommendations, and we tried to reflect that here. So I want to also preface this. I feel like I have a lot of caveats for you today, but I want to preface this by saying that not every single bullet on this slide may equal one person. I think this is something we've struggled with in the implementation committee. I think certainly other committees of the board have experienced this, where people bring multiple perspectives, that intersectionality of perspectives and lived experience and professional experience. And right now, we don't currently have sort of a one-to-one relationship of person on the committee and which seat they're in. And I think we might want to retain that flexibility for the advisory committee. So this is the representation that we're looking for, but we may need more than one person per bullet. We may have one person that represents several of these bullets, and we're trying to leave that a little bit flexible for now. So with that said, we want to maintain a balance like we currently have between the healthcare industry representation and the non-industry representation. We think that's been really important in the success of the implementation committee so far, and we want to continue that in the advisory committee moving forward. So the industry representation would include healthcare payers, large hospitals and health systems, smaller providers, independent providers, as well as an at-large position. Having an at-large position for both industry and non-industry was something the implementation committee recommended we add last week, just to make sure that we have flexibility for capturing perspectives or any emerging issues. On the non-industry side, we would be looking at employers, especially employers who are purchasing healthcare for their employees. We'd be looking at consumer advocates, and again, an at-large position here for some flexibility. When going back to the consumer advocates for a second, I think unlike some of our committees where we think about consumer being a Medicaid member, a person most directly impacted, the cost growth target scope is a little bit broader. It includes all types of insurance in the state. In some ways, everyone on the committee is a consumer because everyone on the committee likely has healthcare or has experienced the healthcare system. So I think we are leaning towards looking for more consumer advocates, consumer representatives, organizations that represent broad consumers rather than sort of the OHP member consumer. I recognize that that's not a clear split, and there's also some problems with one direction over another. So I think we're looking for some of your feedback on that today as well. We would continue to have several ex officio members, so that includes the OHA and DCBS directors or their designees, as well as the state economist. And that state economist involvement is really critical when we get back to revisiting the target itself. We also want some specific expertise. So healthcare financing, healthcare administration, health economics, all of those will help with understanding cost growth and cost growth drivers, as well as understanding what opportunities and strategies we might be able to take as a state to mitigate the cost growth. We also want to add, and this is something new, not something that we currently have had as a focus in our implementation committee, but ensuring equity in policymaking. And I think this is something that we're really hoping can be informed by some of the recommendations coming out of the diversification work. We also want to consider increasing diversity and, again, alignment with those recommendations, and urban and rural representation. We know the health system in Oregon can look really different based on the rural divide, and we want to make sure that we're capturing both of those perspectives. I will add one more comment from the implementation committee discussion of this last week. We asked them what they thought about size. Currently, our implementation committee is 20 members. That's one of the larger committees of the board. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of commitment. And we thought, okay, well, maybe could the advisory committee be a little bit smaller? And some of the feedback we got from the implementation committee was, given all of this representation and expertise that we want to bring together, it is unlikely that we could pull it off with a smaller committee. So again, we're not saying what the right number is. We're not trying to say there should only be 18 members or only 15 or only 25. We're leaving that a little bit open to make sure we have flexibility, and we'd like your feedback on that if that's the right approach as well. Okay. Couple more things. Let's talk about our proposed recruitment plan. Next slide, please. So we have been, again, consulting with the Ignatius and the group, and we were really inspired by the case study that the High Talk presented about their recruitment. I think that was shared at the last board meeting about doing that gap analysis and a much more deliberate recruitment for committee openings. And so we've tried to think about what we would have done sort of in the before times as a business as usual recruitment, and then how can we improve on that. So we would, of course, post the application and the recruitment announcement online. We would email it out to the board and all the committees of the board. We maintain a broad list of interested parties who are tracking the cost growth target. We would let them know. We would let all current implementation committee members know, because they would be invited to apply if they would like to continue. But then we would add some additional efforts. So we asked the implementation committee last week if members would be willing to help with the outreach and the recruitment, and we had buy-in for that. We also plan on doing some provider organization outreach around the cost growth target this fall. I can talk more about that if anyone's curious, but essentially we want to make sure that provider organizations are aware of the cost growth target and know when and where to plug in. And we can also tie some committee recruitment into that. We would like to partner with CPOP and the Regional Health Equity Coalitions and do some outreach via community organizations. We were really inspired by how High Talk did that and would like to build on their experience. And then some targeted outreach as needed. And I think we'll be looking to you as well for some recommendations on where that targeted outreach could or should be. Next. I was going to talk a little bit more about the principles, but I think Ignatius and Susan covered that in detail. So let me go on to the next slide and the timeline. So in July, we reviewed this all with the implementation committee, made some changes based on their feedback. We're reviewing it with you today. We would like to make some changes and feedback based on the discussion coming up in a minute. We'd like to start the recruitment process in August. We would like to get that announcement out. We would like to have the application form and start getting the word out. And we would like to bring a proposed slate of members for your review and potentially approval for your October meeting. We are assuming we might need to do some additional recruitment after that, and that would give us October and November to finalize so that we would be ready to launch the new committee in January. And again, I want to recognize that the timing issue. I know that you'll be receiving more recommendations on overall committee recruitment, and potentially some of those forms and tools and templates might be finalized in October. I think we might look to you to see if you would like us to wait for some of that. I think we do have some concerns about not wanting there to be too long of a gap between when the implementation committee sunsets and when we can stand up the new committee. So again, we don't lose momentum, and we don't lose the opportunity to have a space to continue these conversations about the cost growth target publicly, but we do want to be responsive to the committee membership work that is happening. So that is our proposed timeline, and let me hand it to Kirsten for some reflection.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Sarah and Jeremy, not only for this information, but all the work that goes behind it from you to work with other staff and the committee members who brought us to this point. I've had the pleasure of serving as the liaison to the Cost Growth Committee and was a member of one of the predecessor committees that contributed to this. So before we kick off this discussion, I just wanted to offer kind of two framing points that I think are important considerations that kind of play in the background of the work that we're charged with today and to come. Because I do think that we are in this, the cost growth target is in this period of transition a little bit. So we have the implementation committee now. It's had committees that came before it that were governor appointed and legislatively mandated. And so we're going from this effort that was in its earliest stages exploratory and temporary in nature. And now that baton is being passed to the Health Policy Board. And I think this charge shifts to like implementing regular processes that weave into the structure of our state's healthcare system. So we're looking at some more permanence here. And I think this is squarely in line with our board's long-term charge of guarding affordability. And of course, it is one of our current priorities. So I'm excited by this transition, and I also think we'll be challenged by it. And I think having this presentation coming right after Susan and Ignatius was so, was great, whether thoughtful or coincidence, I'm not sure, but I think so this point has been underscored already today, but I'll say it again, just that I think to ensure the success of this next phase, we need to be thoughtful about the voices in the room, and that is now going to be put on the Health Policies Board to appoint those members rather than the governor or legislatively directed. So I think to that, like looking at the success of the current committee, I do want to just highlight that decisions were not easy in that committee. Consensus didn't always happen. And I think that's evidence of two things. One, they wrestled with real issues, and that this committee will continue to wrestle with challenges. And I think it's also a reflection that there were a variety of voices at that table, and that those were so valuable. So as we go to this next stage of OHPB being responsible for appointing this committee, I think we need to take very seriously the balance of voices on it. And I think that means a mix of industry voices like we saw in the slate, because this is touching various parts of the healthcare systems, but I also think a mix of non-industry voices and having patients and employer purchasers really present is valuable. So with those charges and caveats, I'm happy to kick off the discussion and look forward to hearing others' reactions to the kind of framework placed before us. Bill.
Hi, thanks, Kirsten and Jeremy and Sarah for a great presentation. And I know this is very challenging and sensitive work. It's tricky to do this and get it right. I have a couple of comments and questions, both on the charge to the advisory committee and also the committee membership. My overall impression of the charge is there are a number of words in there that are, I would describe as somewhat soft or unclear. For example, addressing opportunities to reduce cost growth. I'm not sure quite what that means. I wonder if a word like prioritizing or something like that might be a little stronger and a little bit more specific. Even the bullet point about overseeing implementation, I'm not sure what that means exactly. Does it mean literally just seeing or something else? And with regard to the comment that Sarah made, that clarification that the advisory committee will not be responsible for enforcing or ensuring accountability for meeting the targets. I understand that. First, I would say it'd be good to put that in the written report so we don't have to rely on verbal clarification. But I wonder if there's something that the advisory committee could do related to at least the advising on accountability mechanisms or something like that. What's the best way to achieve accountability without getting into specific mechanisms for a particular provider, for example. So rather than being hands off altogether on accountability mechanisms, that there's some advising they could do about overall what's the best approach. On the committee membership, understand what you said about maintaining some flexibility. It's difficult sometimes to categorize folks. I would encourage us to try to put somewhere some clarification. Is it based on, for example, where you're currently working, or whether you're currently employed by, receiving payment from, something like that, X organization, or is it something about your past experience or what? But clarifying how we're going to do this, because my experience in multiple situations like this is it leads, if without clarification, understand we need flexibility, but without some further clarification, end up with a lot of arguments on this. And a couple of suggestions on the non-industry representatives. I think it'd be useful to have both large and small employers. I think they have in some ways different perspectives and different interests. And maybe also consider public and private sector purchasers as members. I understand Oregon Health Authority is kind of an ex officio member, but anyway, there are public sector purchasers that have an interest in these cost growth targets as well. And then the area of expertise, I think having expertise in employer health benefits and the costs that it takes to do employer health benefits, and also from the consumer perspective, the impact of costs on patients and consumers, affordability issues, barriers to care because of high costs would be an important perspective. So it's more than just the perspective of a consumer or patient, but it's expertise in those areas. So hope those helpful. Happy to talk in more detail about those offline.
Thanks, Bill. Those comments are fantastically helpful. I will say to your first comment about the specifics, there are some more specifics. I think the soft language is partly me trying to bring it up for this presentation. But for example, the implementation committee has recently adopted a process and a set of criteria that they will use to assess and prioritize which strategies or recommendations to mitigate cost growth should be pursued. So there sort of is a process that the committee will inherit, and that's been hammered out. I just hand waved all of that in these bullet points.
Great, thanks.
I think the connection to PEB and OHPB and Marketplace is a really good point too. We had a designated seat for the Marketplace Advisory Committee. I personally sort of served as the liaison to PEB and OHPB. I actually think now that we're getting more into implementation, there's actually even more of a probably interest or need for a connection there. So I think it's a really good point.
John has a comment.
Yeah, just quickly, I think this is just terrific progress, and I'm so impressed. I mostly, urge focus on those consumers. And it's great to see that word used, but as we heard earlier, that's not a word that's been well defined by Oregon. And I think this committee is going to, define it to some degree. This is a market activity. I mean, this is a regulation of a market. And so market savvy consumers, I think, are who you'll be looking for. They're out there, but may be tricky to find. So terrific work, and look forward to seeing it move forward.
Yeah, I just want to thank our OHA staff and our fellow board members for all their work on this. I couldn't help but notice, like the timing of this presentation with the work that's happening with the committee membership group. To me, this feels like just the perfect opportunity to really start moving forward some of the recommendations of the committee membership project. I think it would be a really big missed opportunity if we, say, oh, this is a couple months off in alignment, and therefore we're not going to be able to sort of follow some of those recommendations. I know that there's a lot of challenges with that, but as much as we can try to align and sort of look at this as like an opportunity to start figuring out how those recommendations are going to play out in reality, and be comfortable with having to make adjustments as necessary, and probably communicating that sort of this new group that there's sort of these new recommendations and procedures and processes that we're implementing, and that it's going to feel a little bit different, but it's very important as we move forward.
Oscar, can I ask a follow-up to that? I thank you for saying, I think it absolutely would be a missed opportunity. And several of you have commented on the convenient timing of how these two presentations were stacked up. And we totally did that on purpose because we wanted this conversation to build on each other. I think I wasn't clear, Oscar, if you were saying we should postpone our recruitment timeline by a few months, or we should go ahead with our proposed timeline, but make sure we're incorporating as many of these recommendations and aligning as much as we can and using it almost as a trial run.
I would love to hear, I think, both are important. And I think I would love to hear at a later point, like as we move forward, from staff about how, which one would they feel is probably better. Would it make sense to postpone this just a couple months, a few months, or does it make sense to try to move forward and incorporate these as we move the work forward? Obviously there's a lot of new recommendations, like the proposed template for the demographic data and sector data. There's recommendations around like how do we onboard committee members to make sure that they're feeling comfortable in this situation? How do we provide technical assistance for those folks? So I'd be really curious to see how we might be able to like phase in some of these recommendations as we move this work forward.
And let me respond to that. I know, Jessica, I know you have your hand up, but let me just respond to that real quick. I think we were hoping with our proposed timeline to begin recruitment in August. So I think if you're asking for staff input, I personally would say, I think we can do some alignment, and I think we can work on incorporating some draft templates. I think some of the things that you mentioned, like the onboarding and the technical assistance, there's still several months before this committee would launch and we would need to onboard members. So I'm less worried about that timing. I think it's the how do we get the message out? What data are we trying to collect in the application itself? And I do think we can align with at least preliminary recommendations starting now. If you all are comfortable giving us the green light for that. I think what you said earlier, Oscar, about knowing that this is a new process and we might be making adjustments as we go is really important. And I think, again, if you're all comfortable with this, this feels like a really great way to test out some of these new tools and processes.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback. I'd love to, if possible, I know we're running out of time, so I apologize for that. I'd love to hear from, folks involved in the committee membership project, like Ignatius or Leanne or Susan, and sort of figure out like what their thoughts are around sort of phasing in some of their recommendations with standing up this group.
This is Susan. I think that it would be a great opportunity to do some trial run with some of the preliminary recommendations that we have. So I would support moving forward and aligning as we go.
Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's better that that we move forward with recruitment for this group. That, you know, starting probably as soon as possible. There is a lot to get up to speed on. If you're a new member of this group, I was part of the this committee at, you know, when it started, and there is a lot to learn, and we're heading into a new phase of that. So there's going to be a lot of work getting people up to speed on things and answering questions. And so I want to make sure that that group has really the time to dig in and really become as familiar as possible with the cost setting process that we put in place and the history of that group, so that they can be really effective members. The last thing I would say, that the demographic template that was put up, I guess this probably is because I'm an employer, but that kind of made me cringe. There's a lot of really personal questions on there. We are not allowed as employers to ask any of those things. And I don't know. I wonder if there's a better way to identify people who can speak to those perspectives rather than having them fill out something like that. That feels to me very, again, and it's probably from an employer perspective, we would never, ever dream of asking anyone any of those questions. So that's just my input. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, Sarah, Jeremy, Kirsten?
Not on the recruitment or the membership. It sounds like we have the green light to go ahead with our timeline in alignment with the preliminary recommendations and closely tied with the work that Susan and Ignatius are leading. We do have a couple of just program implementation updates in the later slides. I wasn't going to go through them, but they're there for your reference if anyone's curious.
I'll just pipe in to say that I think we should move forward with this recruitment, but I also think let's purposefully come back. And not just for this committee, but maybe also for High Talk, for the committees that move forward with recruitment before the recruitment committee was done with their full set of recommendations, and just make sure that we're realigning and not missing anything for the committees that moved forward earlier. So like High Talk left a space open, which was great. I think we should make sure that there's flexibility on this committee as well, so that we can make adjustments in the future. And I think that flexibility is built into the proposal that Sarah recommendation, without a set number of seats, et cetera. But I think OHA staff, if you could be thoughtful at some point, like put a marker that we make sure that we're double checking alignment.
We should move on. I want to thank Jeremy, Kirsten, and Sarah for the presentation and working very closely with the diversity, equity, and inclusion work and linking these two in partnership. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the board's comments and discussion. We should move on to public comment. We have 2 public comments today, and just as background, Oregon Health Policy Board really appreciates public testimony. It's one of the most important ways we demonstrate our commitment to profound listening and learning. This deep listening means that we won't respond directly to the issues you raised today, nor try to resolve them today. But I want to let you know that we listen carefully and we reflect on the public comment in our working group meetings, as we saw last month. So we look forward to your comment, and we will deliberate carefully and respect and honor your testimony. Each presenter is given 2 minutes. In the event it never feels like enough time, we encourage you to provide written testimony to supplement your oral testimony. There'll be a slide that has a 2-minute timekeeper. Please know that, again, we will discuss the comment next week with OHA. So we have two requests for public comment, one by Marvin Sandness. Will Marvin, Mr. Sanders, please state your name and your affiliation for the record, and we look forward to your comments.
I'm Marv Sanis. I live in Salem, Oregon. Well, the point I watched Dr. Shiri a couple of weeks ago. She did a presentation interviewed by a media person, and I was struck by the lack of the pandemic discussion doesn't seem to have evolved in the last year. We do isolation, we do hospitalization, we do vaccination, and we drop dead. Anyway, that just struck me as odd. The other point I want to make, I'm very active in the recovery community, and the lockdown has been devastating to the recovery community. I've lived in this valley for 76 years and do not know of a single death, but in the last year, I know of dozens of relapse. Older people who don't do Zoom, who can't do meetings with, and they relapse. And relapse, if you suffer from addictive disorder, relapse is often a death sentence, and very, very expensive to the greater community, the families and health. So anyway, those are the 2 points I wanted to make, that why we don't have an evolution of this discussion with this pandemic. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your comment. I appreciate you staying within 2 minutes. The next public comment we have is from Roberto Gamboa, who has provided also written materials in attachment 4. Mr. Gamboa.
Thank you, Chair Bangsberg. My name is Roberto Gamboa. I serve as the director of the Eastern Oregon Health Equity Alliance. Dear Chair Bangsberg, Vice Chair Arana, and members of the Oregon Health Policy Board. The Regional Health Equity Coalitions are reaching out to share principles that RHEX developed related to Oregon's 1115 Medicaid waiver renewal, and would like the Oregon Health Policies Board support in ensuring waiver concepts align with these principles. The inequities that would continue to persist in Oregon are evidence that more must be done to address health equity. This is especially true for populations communities that have been most impacted by historic and contemporary injustices, including but not limited to tribal nations, tribal communities, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Black African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian and Alaska Native populations, and all communities of color, people with disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, and immigrants and refugees. We have decades of research pointing to this plain fact, and yet focused efforts and investments to directly address inequities among these communities are elusive. It is elusive because addressing structural racism and institutional discrimination can be difficult to acknowledge and face head on. The root cause of health inequities have persisted for centuries because systems and institutions have been created to benefit select group of people over time. This must be undone in partnership with community while they lead. According to AGNOR, structural racism had a substantial role in shaping the distribution of social determinants of health and the population health profile of the USA, including persistent health inequities. While communities of color experience avoidable inequities due to structural racism, there remains a great strength, resilience, and wisdom which should inform efforts to ultimately address health equity issues. Meaningful impacting health equity challenges require redistribution of resources, and there must be intentional actions focused on this. I'll highlight some key points. We have been participating in an Oregon Health Authority work group related to targeted investments, more specifically related to community managed funds. We've developed a set of principles by which we hope all waiver concepts will be aligned. We want to target investments and efforts to populations, communities who have been most impacted, and like I mentioned the list prior. We want to shift power and decision-making authority so community voice related to need ultimately leads in development of action to mitigate ineffective approaches and unintended consequences. Create opportunities to build sustainable infrastructure that works to develop and maintain systems and programs that recognize, reconcile, and rectify historical and contemporary injustices, and to support community leadership development, as well as build and rebuild trust between health systems and community. Now, Chair, I noticed the timer didn't go off, so feel free to stop me if I reach 2 minutes.
You are a bit over 2 minutes.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wrap up. Any last comment you want to make? We can.
I would just say, for as long as health systems operate on a business model, profit will continue to be the priority over the wellness of people. Until that fundamental shift happens, we can expect communities that have been most harmed by inequities to continue to grow sicker, and then need to create more accountability at every juncture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you. That is the end of public comment. We will take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:40 to hear the Director Pat Allen's update. So I look forward to seeing you all at 10:40. Welcome back, everyone. Next on our agenda is update from Director Pat Allen. Pat.
Great, thanks, Chair Bangsberg, members of the committee. I'll talk about three things today. I want to touch on the not the most recent heat wave, but the heat wave before that. I'll talk a little bit, obviously, as it seems we have for a long time now, COVID and kind of current circumstances, and then touch a little bit on last legislative session and how that impacts our strategic planning. First, in terms of the late June heat wave, I'm sure you've all seen as much as I have in terms of reports of fatalities, over 100 confirmed and suspected fatalities. Still looking at emerging data and information about that heat wave, but there was a after action report that the governor directed the Office of Emergency Management to put together, which had a big impact on how we responded to the much less severe heat wave that occurred last week. And there were a number of pieces that worked considerably better, some areas that still needed some improvement, but various agencies and entities were able to do things like automated calls and texts, other ways of contacting people who are vulnerable to extreme heat, much more significant availability of cooling centers, better direction of resources or information about resources to people. Now, of course, the heat ended up not being nearly as significant. So, I wouldn't say it was a fair test that those improvements were necessarily effective. But in terms of the effort and work that you saw on the ground, it certainly was smoother than the effort was in the last heat wave. In the last heat wave, I think it's going to be really important to really be able to see complete death investigation information, which is a process that actually takes a bit of time. I think one of the assumptions that got made immediately during and after the heat wave was that there was some kind of an instant information system that occurs so that, if someone dies on Sunday morning in a heat incident, that there are people on Sunday afternoon who know about that. And can use that information to take action. And death reporting and investigation doesn't actually work that way. There were certainly improvements that could be made in that reporting system, and those got talked about in the after action report as well. But it's going to be important to know things like locations. How many people, we know some number of people died homeless in cars, versus people who were unhoused and out on the streets. Excuse me, and those kinds of things. And so I think that will help us be able to inform not sort of immediate in a heat wave actions, but longer term actions about how to be able to prepare for an event like that. It was also challenging. I know I will confess, and I think others, it's probably the same unless you lived somewhere like Arizona. I had no sort of mental conception of what 117 degrees with an 80-degree overnight temperature really actually means and implies, and I think until you experience that, it's hard to know that. It also didn't help that the Oregonian flashed up a 117-degree forecast on Monday, and then on Tuesday ran a headline saying, "Is it really going to be 117? Probably not," which kind of took the wind out of the sails of some folks for urgency. So I think we learned a lot through that event. And we're continuing beyond the after action report to continue to build improvements into the system. Turning to COVID, we're obviously in a pretty massive wave driven by the Delta variant. OHSU last week estimated that nearly 90% of cases in Oregon are Delta cases. CDC on Friday released data that indicates that Delta is about as contagious as chickenpox. Which was really sort of totally horrifying news. We've been used to an R0, which is the reproductive rate, if you aren't taking steps like masks or vaccinations or those kinds of things, for, I guess I'd call it COVID original, that was somewhere in the 1 to 3 range. 1 to 3 people would get sick. You would get 1 to 3 other people sick if you were infected. And now we're looking at numbers that are up around 8 or 9. And so it's significantly more contagious than the original COVID was, and significantly more contagious than than the Alpha variant that drove our spring surge. Nevertheless, we're continuing to see the large majority of cases be amongst those who are unvaccinated or not fully vaccinated. And so vaccines continue to be extremely effective. There's been some confusing information about breakthrough cases and about the ability to transmit the disease out there. And I want to touch on that quickly just to clarify. CDC did an analysis of a couple of circumstances, but especially an outbreak in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And one of the things they found is that if you had a breakthrough case of COVID that was Delta variant, unlike previous variants, if you were vaccinated, you now had as much virus in your throat and nose as somebody who was not vaccinated. That's new. Previously, the vaccines would keep other variants from generating the same viral load. However, you still have to have a breakthrough case, which is still rare. And I think what people have been hearing is, well, everybody who's vaccinated is just as likely to spread the disease as everybody who's unvaccinated, which is fundamentally not true. The other number that's gotten people's attention is the fact that 74% of 200 odd cases in Provincetown were breakthrough cases. And oh my gosh, does that mean the vaccine doesn't work with Delta? No, not at all. The principle to keep in mind is the more people who are vaccinated, the more cases will be breakthrough cases. And if you think about it this way, if 100% of people are vaccinated, then every case will be a breakthrough case, and no cases will not be breakthrough cases because nobody's unvaccinated. And that's what's going on in the Provincetown case. Vaccination rates in Massachusetts, and especially in that part of Massachusetts, are extremely high. And so the 74% of cases being breakthrough is not the important number. The important number is out of all the thousands of people who partied over the 4th of July weekend in Provincetown, only a couple hundred got sick, and none of those were hospitalized. And so that's not an indication that the vaccine is failing. It's actually an indication that the vaccine is extremely effective. Cases in Oregon are rising extremely rapidly. Hospitalizations are going up extremely rapidly. We're now at a level of hospitalization that is above the rate that we were at in the spring outbreak, but still well below the levels of the previous winter outbreak. So we've still got some slack, but the hospital systems are much more stressed now than they were then, based on staffing shortages and burnout and all the other things that occupy hospital beds that when we were much more shut down are more likely to happen now, from traffic accidents to boating accidents, heat-related illness, all those kinds of things. So we've taken a number of steps in the last couple of weeks, including a recommendation for indoor masking, governor's announcement that we'll be requiring masking in K-12 schools, some other steps around vaccination that are going to be announced shortly that I can't share a lot of detail yet because it hasn't all been worked out, but that's kind of where we're sitting right now in terms of the pandemic. Last thing I'll touch on just very quickly in terms of strategic planning. As you know, we've been working through a kind of a long strategic planning process that has sort of now morphed into several channels that we're going to wrap together. Our performance management system that identifies outcomes that we at the very top level have tried to call out health equity, make sure we're measuring and at the top level seeing health inequities as the primary thing we're trying to measure, updating that system. The work we're doing around anti-racism in the organization, broadening that training and that investment and those changes in how we do business that Leanne touched on at the beginning of her presentation. And then the huge investment the legislature made that's really driven primarily by health equity, whether it's explicitly health equity investments in our infrastructure or things like behavioral health investments and Measure 110 investments that are driven by their equity implications. What we're going to try to do is wrap that all into a single package of work that we're calling our transformation work. So it's really not strategic planning anymore so much as it is what are the things we're doing to implement transformation in the organization for us to become an anti-racist agency focused on being capable of delivering our strategic goal of eliminating health inequities by by 2030. And make sure that instead of each of these investments, the legislature is maybe being an isolated pocket that's going to go off and do its thing and maybe talk to the other pieces, that this gets managed as an entire body of work to ensure that we maximize the benefit that we can for health equity in all of these investments. And I think we've talked before about the kind of the impressive laundry list of what the legislature has provided us with. I know I've only got 10 minutes. I've probably already used it all up. So let me stop there and see if anyone's got questions.
Questions or comments? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Pat, thanks. That was helpful. But I have to tell you, and I'm sure you won't be surprised at this, you know, my 70-year-old friends, who all my friends are 70-year-old, we're getting nervous again. We're getting nervous. We're getting anxious. You know, we see folks our age still dying in Oregon and elsewhere. We see what's going on in Israel and other countries with third shots. You know, I remember how older folks all got stirred up back in February when.
As do I, vividly.
Yeah, and I think the governor was right, and that wasn't a sacrifice that I thought was too great then. But I think that concern and all, I can feel it in my folks. Urge you all think about it. You know, it's very confusing to us why healthcare workers aren't all vaccinated. Really confusing that congregate care folks aren't. You know, and my friends who are in congregate care are, you know, just keeping their fingers crossed. They are really worried. So just wanted to speak my mind on that.
I appreciate that. I do anticipate guidance from CDC and FDA sooner rather than later in terms of boosters. As you alluded to, Israel has adopted boosters for people 60 and older, I believe it is. And I would look for news on the healthcare worker vaccination front soon.
Other comments or questions? All right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Pat. We'll move on to the Medicaid waiver update. Today we are joined by our special guest, Xenia Junkier, Director of the Oregon Health Equity Alliance, and Annie Valtierra Sanchez, Director of So Healthy, to hear about the community managed funds relating to the waiver proposal targeted towards health equity investments, and to learn more about a new concept to improve the transition for members. Before Lori starts today with the Medicaid waiver update, I'll also take a moment to ask our special guests to introduce themselves.
Yeah, David, did I catch you? You want us to introduce ourselves before Lori starts? As I said, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great, I'll go ahead. Hi, everyone. My name is Xenia Junkier, she and her pronouns. I'm the director at the Oregon Health Equity Alliance, or OHPB. We work in what is known as Washington, Multnomah, and Clackamas counties. It's good to be here with you all today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. My name is Annie Valtierra Sanchez. I am the director of So Healthy, which is the Southern Oregon Health Equity Coalition. I also serve on the Health Equity Committee for the state, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's great to have you here. So I'll turn over to Lori Corner, the Senior Medicaid Policy Advisor for OHA.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here and happy to have Annie and Xenia co-present with me. So we'll be hearing from them on the community managed funds. I'm going to start off and just give some context. If we can go to the next slide, it will lay out the agenda for today. So I'm going to just give some general project updates. Talk a little bit about kind of set the stage for the community managed funds and health equity investments, turn it over to Annie and Xenia to talk more about community managed funds, and then I'll wrap up with how those community managed funds are going to be dovetailed with the health equity investments, and then our transitions of care work that we've been focusing on for the waiver as well. Next slide. So this is just a recap of the 4 big policy areas, and you'll notice that we've changed the language on a couple of them. So the first is maximizing our coverage for the Oregon Health Plan. This work will go in concert with work that Jeremy Vandehey is doing on expanding just insurance coverage for Oregonians across the state. And in the waiver, we're focusing on Medicaid and the Oregon Health Plan. The next big policy area is the focus is on transitions of care, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of this presentation. But we are looking to stabilize transitions so that people on the Oregon Health Plan minimize their disruptions in care and have seamless transitions from one setting to the next. Our global budget piece is really focusing on encouraging smart, flexible spending, but with a focus on health equity, and also a value-based budget is how we're thinking about it, instead of our kind of traditional terminology of global budget. And then finally, we will spend some time talking about health equity investments, where we will be asking the federal government to share in some of the savings that we will be developing through this waiver, and wish to have that focused on investments in health equity. Next slide. You've seen this slide before. It's just a recap on our timeline. I will highlight here that we began drafting in June. We're now in August. We went through a public engagement process and are finalizing our concept papers. They should come out sometime toward the end of August to the public. And that's been based on a round of public engagement and feedback after the first drafts were made public. We still are on target to submit our waiver application in December. Next slide. Here's I guess some of our more recent work. We had our first meeting with Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services team. It's called the demonstration group. And that was really just to lay out our broad concepts and our timeline. We had a positive reaction to the policy concepts from the team. We're looking to them to start regular meetings once we submit the concept papers, which we anticipate to have them submitted in August. We have a meeting set up with the new what's called CMCS administrator, really the administrator that oversees the Medicaid portion of CMS. We're very fortunate. He's the former Medicaid director from Massachusetts. So he went directly from being Medicaid director of Massachusetts to this new seat. I've had the opportunity to work closely with him on the National Association for Medicaid Directors Board. He's very bright, very thoughtful, and we are going to be meeting with him, I believe, next week. So we're fortunate to get in early. He was just appointed first week of July. Tribal consultation, a formal tribal consultation begins in August. We have been meeting with the tribes, so this is continued work. We will, as I mentioned, finish up our policy concept papers and submit those to CMS for just an initial review of, so they start to understand, what we're thinking, and we can understand where there may be some sticking points and other areas that, are going to be relatively easier to have approved. And then in fall, there will be another round of public comment, and that's formal public comment. The timelines on that before a Medicaid application are defined by law, so we will start that in the fall. Next slide. So here we're gonna talk a little bit about the community managed funds and then the health equity investments. Next slide. So with the community managed funds and the health equity investments, what are we trying to solve? Many of the upstream factors that affect health are not addressed by our traditional power structures and our traditional health system. And sometimes it's because the health system's too large or the power structures are too large to break through. Sometimes things that really affect the health of populations are not traditionally defined as a health issue. And sometimes because community is not involved in the decision-making, the real root of problems are not identified. So we are looking to redirect resources and power to try to solve some of these problems and really address the underlying issues of inequity, and both from the structural perspective and from a health perspective around where health inequities exist. Next slide. And I want to highlight that this idea is very consistent with the Oregon Health Policy Board's definition of health equity. And I want us to focus on the two bullets. Achieving health equity is going to require an equitable distribution or redistribution of resources and power, and recognizing that historical injustices exist. And so, when we're thinking about the community managed funds, when we're thinking about health equity investments, we're really thinking hard about how to redistribute power and resources to in recognition of the contemporary injustices that exist. Next slide. And I want to take a second before I turn this over to our guests, that what we've heard in our public feedback and comment is that a real recommendation to give decision-making power back to the impacted communities. And you'll see in that call out box on the right, one of our participants said, who better to say what's needed in the community than community? That problems that are, communities face can be bigger than CCOs or outside of the scope of providing, physical, behavioral, and oral health services to our Oregon Health Plan members. And we really want to be thinking about long-term investments. Community can mean many different things. And so what we're talking about here are, local stakeholders who are impacted by the potential changes of the waiver, like Oregon Health Plan members, when we're thinking about who's going to be most effective. And in particular, we're interested in hearing from communities that have a history of facing structural injustices and still currently do. Next slide. So I'm going to turn these next slides over to Xenia and Annie. The Regional Health Equity Coalitions have been working with OHA staff on these concepts, and we're very fortunate to have them here to speak to both House Bill 3353, which they helped to create, and then some of the work that we've been doing together.
Great, thank you, Lori. So again, my name is Zenia Junkier. I want to start out by just grounding us a little bit in what the Regional Health Equity Coalition model is. As a reminder, Regional Health Equity Coalitions are cross-sector, community-led, collaborative coalitions. They're really based and rooted and grounded in existing community-led efforts. Right? So they're not a set of groups or an organization that comes into a community and says, here is what we think you should do. And really the basis for the work of the Regional Health Equity Coalitions is believing in authentic community engagement, believing in community-led and driven solutions to build capacity that we can then create shifts and culture shifts and systems change, et cetera, that leads to health equity. So I give that kind of I give that definition of regional health equity coalitions because our theory of change really influenced the ways in which we engaged in these conversations. I also want to give a big shout out to Annie, her colleagues at So Healthy and their local CCOs for even bringing the conversations around the 1115 waiver to the other regional health equity coalitions in ways that were accessible and in ways that allowed us to see that there was a place for us to help to try to determine how we could be engaged in this process. So House Bill 3353, which again was really, driven and led by some of the folks at So Healthy and their local CCOs. And it was an opportunity not only for us to learn more about the waiver process, but to really see how there was an opportunity to redistribute funds to community that were in alignment with our values as regional health equity coalitions and our theory of change. So we started doing this work, last year, kind of long before this bill was even crafted, to think about how we can build in more flexibility in spending of Medicaid dollars, thinking about how the funds from local CCOs get out to our communities. Are those programs impactful? Could there be something that we could do that would make them even more impactful? And then we wanted to build on the success of things like health-related services, including increased accountability around those health-related services and other equity issues within CCOs. So in House Bill 3353, there's a requirement, as you can see here, request CMS approval to direct 3% of CCO budgets towards investments related to health equity. This was incredibly important for us, in part, I think to Lori's point, we as Regional Health Equity Coalitions, and I know a lot of folks likely on this call too, who are really grounded in community-led solutions, believe that communities hold their own solutions. So if we can identify ways to redistribute and share resources back with community, then those solutions really lie within those communities. So we worked hard to bring our theory of change, our experience, and all of our advocacy efforts to not only this particular policy, but subsequently to this requirement around the 3% of funding being reallocated. There are specific requirements for the spending. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But some high level points there are the additional requirements for spending. So of that 3%, 30% would be spent on programs or efforts to achieve health equity. And then 20% would be focused on behavioral health and culturally responsive services. And then certainly there are some conversations that we've been having, and the model will propose around governance to ensure that we're also looping in existing structures like the CCO, CACs, and other bodies that can really influence how these funds are spent. So this is the community oversight portion of this bill, because it's really important for us to not only have in this policy or in statute, language to redistribute money to communities, but if we don't have community-led and driven oversight there, oftentimes we see those monies not actually impacting the community in the way that we want them to. Next slide, please. So from the starting point of HB 3353 and the subsequent 12 meetings that we've had with OHA team members to really try to identify, okay, maintain the fidelity of this particular policy, influencing, using our experiences and expertise to influence the ways in which funds are reallocated, what opportunities exist here. And so we really proposed this model of how to build from the intent of 3353 to increase accountability to community, community, emphasizing community role, right? The role is not just to apply for funds or receive funds once they are allocated, but community really has a role throughout this entire process, including the role to help identify investment decisions. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We did a lot of work. Over the course of 2 months, we did an incredible amount of work. The least of it was not just the creation of the model, but it was really the process. I think this was one of the first times that at least myself as a representative from a regional health equity coalition had worked with OHA stakeholders in this way to create a model to redistribute funds. Early on, regional health equity coalitions, and again, shout out to So Healthy, approached OHA and said, we know that there's an 1115 waiver process happening. It's coming up. We really want to be involved. We want to be part of that process. We think we have a lot to bring to that process. And then I'm thankful that, after some time, OHA said, hey, you know what, we do want to engage you. We see the benefit of this. And I don't think that they didn't see the benefit early on. I just think there's a lot of moving pieces all the time. And my understanding is this is one of the processes that hasn't historically had really strong community engagement. So to be able to engage in this way is incredibly important. We also wanted to make sure that we were in alignment with other initiatives, right? We didn't want to create something new. We wanted to really build from what was working, what we knew were already community-led or driven or influenced spaces, and to really build on that so that we could have as much of a community-driven process as possible. Again, really highlighting that the process in some ways is as important as the outcome and the relationships that we've built, the ability to capacitate ourselves as regional health equity coalitions, and then really to advocate for the strongest community-led solutions possible. Next slide, please. All right, so in this slide, you'll see the principles that we used, and some of these conversations we had internally around what are our values, how do we want to move through this process. For other folks that have worked with either OHE or other regional health equity coalitions, sometimes we do this process where we engage in a racial justice charter process or some other process to really ground us. We didn't do that in this case, but what we did was have really intentional conversations about what our values were, because we knew that that would influence subsequently the model that we created. So, we really talked about targeted investments. We talked about, who communities most impacted were, how systemic racism and structural oppression are continuing to impact the communities that we serve and that we are part of. And it was really important to us that, again, these targeted investments went directly to communities facing the greatest health inequities. The second box shows the shift of power. I'm sure for most folks that have done some sort of racial justice work, we know that shifting power and ensuring decision-making to community is incredibly important. So we talked about how do we shift power? How do we ensure that regional health equity coalitions and other communities have a space to say how these monies are reinvested? We wanted to create opportunities to build sustainable infrastructure. A lot of the community-based organizations, culturally specific community-based organizations, regional health equity coalitions, we are building the plane as we're flying it. We're trying to build some infrastructure in with the funds that we receive to do that. It's really important if we want to think about long-term sustainable health equity initiatives to really build in that infrastructure and invest in the infrastructure. And then support this community leadership development piece, which is, if at OHE we use an organizing model, we're always trying to not only work ourselves out of a job, but capacitate community members to continue to be part of solutions. And this was something that felt really integral in this process too. And then spending a lot of time in the process helped us to build trust. And it helped us to have some of those hard conversations when we were saying, no, this is what we want. And, potentially institutions saying, we don't really know how to get there. We were able to say, okay, well, let's try to figure out solutions together because we have built this trust. And, at the end of the day, I think we just want to make sure that we are grounded in a community-led solution. We have governance that includes community members, and that we are actively working on systems change work and shifting power. I will pass it over to Annie to talk a little bit about the governance structure.
Thank you, Xenia. Well, what can I add? I just want to start off too by off of what Xenia just presented on the principles. earlier there was a public comment read, and I just want to bring it up again. The populations that we're talking about in House Bill 3353 and through this process are include, but are not limited to tribal nations, tribal communities, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Black, African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian, Alaskan Native populations, communities of color, people with disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, and immigrants and refugees. So I just want to, being here, listening to the rest of the meeting, when I am hearing about equity and other initiatives, it really, these are the populations that we're talking about when we're talking about this model, when we're talking about shifting power, investment in communities that have been underrepresented, underserved, and really working from an upstream model. We don't want to say from the bottom up, but upstream, really informing, really taking into account that these are the populations and this is the ultimate accountability point. This is where we know if we are creating equity or not. So with the governance structure that we envision through, and I can say through, being part of So Healthy and part of the whole House Bill 3353 and working together with the OHA's Community Managed Funds team, that when we look for the alignment, how the bill informs this model, what are we proposing, what is needed, what would it look like, ideally, and this established in the House Bill 33, that there will be an oversight committee, a statewide state committee. Obviously, Office of Equity and Inclusion makes sense for us, and even knowing that sometimes certain departments, certain groups, certain divisions will be doing, will be tasked with doing equity, and not a whole, organization or entity or agency. When we talk about shifting power, maybe we have to start somewhere, and sometimes we do start with who's been doing it. And this is one reason why we said OHA, OEI will be a place where we can house a statewide oversight committee, and creating off of that a governance structure that we propose that then we'll have other community collaboratives. When we were having this discussion, that coalition name came up, and I said, well, there's already coalitions, and it's a very specific definition that we got established through another House bill. So really thinking of what would it look like at a regional level and a state level, and where the connections are. Obviously, there is reporting from OHA. There is the need for different regions to address the needs in those regions. And I can tell from just even the regional health equity coalitions that exist right now, we look very different. We advocate for a lot of the same things, but the populations are different. Some have more of a tribal communities than others. And so we have to take into account that those organizations that live there, the communities, the people who live there don't all have the same experience across the state. So taking that into account is the model for the governance structure, and requiring that there will be a lead entity that will represent and serve the priority populations in each region, a community council that will include community and health systems partners, but where community will also have a strong role in decision-making, and that there will be a funding reporting manager or investment decision. So, we don't want to think that there is no accountability, but at the same time, we are very aware that reporting and on funding and making decisions on investment, if we want to do an equitable job, that we want to take into account the voices that are at the table, and especially those who are most impacted. And with that, also community collaboratives will be not only community-led, but ideally leveraging existing structures. So if there's already community-based organizations, and as Zinnia mentioned, they're usually pretty taxed in terms of capacity, resources, but a lot of them already have the connections with the community. So leveraging on that existing infrastructure or structure that they have in those relationships, and type of framework to create oversight committees regionally. And so even though we're talking about each collaborative can include a lead entity, a community council, and a manager to report the fund and do the reporting, it doesn't mean that one entity could not play the multiple roles. So can I move to the next slide, please? So this is just a sort of like a visual of like the 3%, which I know when some of our conversations initially we co-writing the bill, we wanted to put more, 3% doesn't seem like it's a lot. And then dividing that into other different buckets of important things that we identified in communities and across the state. So this is a visual breakdown of the 3%, where 30% minimum will go towards programs or efforts to improve health equity for racial, culturally underserved populations, as I mentioned, and as we identified in House Bill 3353. The request here is that this funding will be directed to communities themselves to decide according to their identified needs. We talk about health equity in terms of social determinants of health. So we're not just saying money needs to be for, a doctor's appointment, a direct service, a direct medical service, but that it is communities who identified root causes and where those investments should be going to address those health inequities. I already mentioned there is, different regions have different experiences, different root causes, so letting them identify that, as well as also communicating with community advisory committees, CACs. We know that, and even with regional health equity coalitions, we work on like the CHIP, the CHA, some of these where we identified community health improvement plans and what's needed. So finding some alignment with that as well. And additionally, the collaboratives will also coordinate with a statewide committee to evaluate investments. So when we talked in our group, we talked about the importance of using community-based participatory methods to evaluate, right? Again, there is a big task. So how do we leverage those connections regionally and with the state committee, and having different points of accountability in this case as well, and where are the investments going? And I think when we're talking about reporting or not reporting just in terms of money, but reporting inequities or identifying, are we shifting anything? Are we shifting power? Are we making a shift in health equity or inequities, that we will also be able to pinpoint where the investments have been made? For example, root causes versus direct services, and see how that, it's working in different communities. We also have a 20% out of that 3%, 20% for enhanced provider payments. And this spending will be directed towards enhanced payments for providers with a focus on culturally and linguistic responsive services and behavioral health. That also includes traditional health workers. As we know, they play a vital role in our communities and in supporting community health. And not to mention trying to improve the trust between the systems of care in communities of color. So we think that's very vital in terms of creating community health. And after those two pockets, the other one will be more of a flexible and responsive to community needs, could also go through different areas, could still go to OHP, member health equity, and health-related social needs, like the health-related services that the CCOs have as they call flexible services. So it could be adding to some of that. I can say that in our region, not only due to COVID, but also to the wildfires that devastated a great portion of our area here in our county, that looking at CCOs also to how they were investing some of the funding that they had to let's call this flexible services, did make a difference in how some of us responded to community. And so that's the other pocket. And I will move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we talk about the shift of power and resources to community. And, you know, in the last 18 months, we can see that there is so much work to do. I think it has proven the importance of ensuring community voices are the drivers of investments that impact health equity. The imbalance that, as we mentioned, the imbalance that has been seen and felt across the state with community-based organizations who are just chronically under-resourced in compared to healthcare, and still trying to carry that huge load and showing up for community and just showing up as needed for, you know, for anything. So these organizations, as I mentioned, that already exist, will be ideal in forming partnerships to build community investment collaboratives. And this is where we not only talk about like the shifting of power, because sometimes we don't think that we're shifting power or sharing power, who makes the decisions. But if there is no, if we're really trying to, if the goal is to eliminate health disparities, we have to be willing to shift resources too. So it's not just saying, well, buy community-led organizations, or we'll buy community members to sit at the table and listen to what we're going to decide, or ask them a few questions, or see if they have anything to say. When we talk about community shifting power, it is that we listen. We listen to community, we listen to understand and to do things different. We don't just default to, we know better, we've been doing this. And investing money shows that we are shifting to what is needed, and that we are really intentional about eliminating health equities. So this is some of the things that we discussed with our community managed funds team, and I feel pretty good about how we landed in this model, what it entails. We know this is just the beginning of, you know, the bill was one thing, working through this process is another, and that implementation is also, you know, is going to be another task. Coming from a regional health equity coalition model, knowing that there is that infrastructure support that is needed to really uphold that, and ultimately that knowing that this is a Medicaid waiver bill that is a 5-year investment, we're hoping that there's infrastructure put in place, that there is principles put in place that we've presented, that there is different things that the agency is also doing to create a sustainable model. So we don't want to create a model that just lives in paper, that we're trying to fight through 5 years to get it implemented, and that at the end of 5 years, we're working on something else and things haven't shifted. So really looking long-term investment, honoring the principles, honoring community, and really taking into account that community is the ultimate accountability point. And with that, I will hand it over back to Lori. She will introduce a waiver concept that her other group worked on, and on how to increase support for community investment collaboratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie and Xenia. That was wonderful. I want to pause and check with Chair Bangsberg. Do you want to pause and have questions about the what we covered so far, or do you want to wait till the end?
I think let's open up to questions and check in with people, and then move forward. We have another half hour left of the meeting.
So take some questions now.
Yes, please. I think Kirsten raised her hand.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm excited by a lot of this. Excited by this direction. So this is awesome. I had one question and one comment. well, I guess I have two comments. One, just I think this is so squarely in line when we talk about shifting power, shifting resources. And I'm excited by this kind of community decision on where resources go, rather than like community input that gets the like, oh, okay, we'll listen to you this time because we agree with you. Like, no, we're shifting power and resources. Really excited by that. I was curious about the statewide oversight committee and what level of transparency is expected with that committee. And just as a side comment, I think I couldn't help but think about health system community benefit requirements also overseen by the health authority, and how we make sure that observations and lessons learned in under a regional health equity model where that spending is kind of community driven directly, how we make sure and share lessons learned into the other areas of the health system that in theory are that are intended to do some of the same work, but are going about it in usually a different way. So I want to make sure that we're exporting knowledge and good ideas and building off of that. But yeah, my one question was around expected transparency of this oversight committee. Like, is that a public body? Are those public meetings?
Yes, I can answer that real quick. So there's a little bit of wording that we still have to do around that, even deciding how the connection between the regional collaboratives and the state oversight, but definitely finding alignment. And I can tell you from our work that transparency is key. It's key when we're working with agencies, when we're working with community, and that's what builds trust. So definitely opening or definitely a great question to ask us or ask us who are shaping how that's going to function and who will be. And I think talking about transparency is also the big piece of accountability, right? Are we keeping to who is part of those collaboratives and who are making decisions on investments and directing and guiding? So I hope that answers. We don't have like the ultimate final, like what it will look like, but definitely it is very important. And the other piece you mentioned was, your question was around regional health equity coalitions and the model that already exists. Is that right?
Yeah, that might be more to OHA staff, and I don't know that there is an answer there, but I guess I just wanted to tie those that, like, as this develops, I think we need to make sure that we are.
I think it's a great question because even as us, I can say I speak for our coalition. Looking through this model, we said, well, wait a minute, like we're already a coalition that's made up of different sectors in our area, that we have community partners who are part of the coalition. But then again, taking into account that we don't have regional health equity coalitions throughout the state. So we have a bill that passed, and that's going to create some expansion, but it's not going to be immediate. And we still have, 25 counties that don't have a regional health equity coalition. So I've been with our coalition for 5 years and really believe in the model. Again, upstream, community driven, and just seeing, like I said, in the last 18 months, how community, we've been so like distant, but we still been so connected with community and building that trust. So I think it's going to take some time in different areas where there is no regional health equity coalitions. But I do see that we'll be playing a part in this process as well.
And I do want to add that the oversight committee is stated in the statute in the bill, and it would have to be a public meeting, just as far as how, state guidelines. Any other questions?
So we have some time for discussion at the end.
Okay, great. I'm going to now talk about health equity investments, and before I do, I really want to thank Annie and Xenia for their collaboration in the work on the community managed funds, because and the other regional health equity coalition partners, and OHA staff that included staff from HPA and the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So, you know, it was a real positive, thoughtful coming together, and you know, the principles that they established up front were really important, and I think moved the work forward in a very positive way. And part of the reason that I acknowledge that is these health equity investments were then, this is what we were calling before health equity zones. And in hearing feedback from community, in hearing feedback from stakeholders, and we have shifted the language and some of the thinking around it, and instead of health equity zones, we're talking about health equity investments. And the idea for these investments are going to tie directly to the regional collaboratives that Annie just talked about. So that's what I have coming here in the next few minutes. Next slide. And this is just a recap of the focus that the work group came up with, that Annie and Xenia talked through. And we're using these principles also to drive the health equity investment model. And since it's been talked about at length, I'm not going to go through it, but it's the same model. So next slide, please. And so when we're talking about these health equity investments, what we're thinking about, and I'm going to kind of step up to a very high level. We have the community managed funds that are spelled out in House Bill 3353. Those funds come through the CCOs, as, you know, where they pay out part of their, 3% of their revenue. These health equity investments would augment that. And this is a request as part of our waiver to the federal government. And what we will be asking is, the federal government, hey, we're making savings through this waiver, through our value-based budget, and we want to share in some of those savings. And the goal of that is to reduce health equities in Oregon. We want to reinvest those savings to community to improve social, economic, and physical health of communities, focus on larger scale investments, and really partner with community leaders to identify what those strategies are. So I just want to call out that we're talking about a separate stream of funding, and that this separate stream of funding is contingent on waiver approval, and through our discussions with the federal government. Let's see. Next slide. And really, we will achieve the savings through the implementation of the Sustainable Healthcare Cost Growth Target Program. I believe Sarah Bartleman reported on that today. So it's the Medicaid part of that, potentially even the potential Medicare savings if we are successful. And so taking a portion of those savings, or requesting a portion of those savings that the federal government is making, to direct them towards health equity in Oregon. And that's partly why we're thinking about the global budget as a value-based budget. So this would be very similar to, for those of you that are familiar with value-based payments, and then distributing savings. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we want to build the capacity around the community collaboratives that have been identified as part of our amplifying the House Bill 3353 intent. So we want to formalize or leverage that work and then create these community collaboratives. And Annie outlined it really well. The community collaboratives would be community driven. They need to have a lead organization. They need to have a fiscal organization. And those can be the same or different organizations depending on the region. They will define their own region, and the community entities can be comprised of the RHECs, health councils, and other community bodies, CCOs, the community advisory councils, local hospitals, local public health. So the idea is that we really have a collaborative that's community driven, but brings in the health system. The other piece, and so I do want to say that then they would define their region. So rather than creating a specific zone, that's got boundaries, that the community collaboratives would define the region. What we envision is that OHA would then release a request for information to understand more about the geographic boundaries, and then work to try to cover the entire state. Start with those coalitions that are put together and then really try to put some resources in. We know, as Annie described, there is not an RHEC in all region of the state. So we may need to find other coalitions that are operating in certain areas and things like that. Then the other piece that I think is really important, and that we've heard both from community and from CCOs, is that these collaboratives will need some sort of infrastructure grant. So we envision taking some of the federal dollars, and that would be to fund administrative work, capacity building for the community entities, really establishing community leadership, and to develop the infrastructure so community entities can accept and administer both the CCO funds that they receive, and then potentially funds from the Fed, that we can administer as grants from the federal government, even potentially. And I think Kirsten, you mentioned the community benefit dollars, that there is a potential we can have community benefit dollars come into these coalitions as well. So we need to build the infrastructure for that. Next slide. Then once that infrastructure is built, the next step would be to really focus on the community identified investments. So build the infrastructure and then allow the community in that collaborative to identify where investments need to be made. Those could be things like further development of a culturally responsive workforce, outdoor opportunities and green spaces for folks in the community that historically don't have access to outdoors, affordable high quality childcare, housing related services, whatever that community feels like they need to improve health and health equity. And then next slide. And then the OHA would be administering grants to the community collaboratives to direct those funds in the community-led initiatives. And this approach addresses the concern that we've heard that potentially these health equity investments could be duplicative to other community-based collaborative efforts. And so the whole idea is to bring the community together and bring the health system with it, and to have a collaborative as opposed to silos. So next slide. This slide asks for questions and feedback. I do have to cover transition, so would you like to pause and take questions here?
clarifying questions from the board?
Just a clarifying question, Lori, it sounds like, you know, if this is approved by the federal government to allow these savings to be reinvested into health equity, then the idea is for OHA to use the collaboratives to basically grant out or manage the savings that will be available.
Essentially, OHA would be the grantor to a collaborative, and then the collaborative could further distribute those funds within their community. So yes, they may choose to fund an initiative. They may choose to issue grants. The collaboratives would have some leeway in terms of how they would distribute funding.
Okay.
Great. So I will move on to the next slide. I'm going to take just I think this will be pretty brief. We've talked about this policy area before, and the focus of it, as it's evolved, is really on stabilizing transitions of care. And so the kinds of transitions that we're talking about, for example, are people who are leaving the criminal justice system and need to reestablish their Oregon health plan coverage. That would be an example of a transition, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Just to remind you, the goal of this policy area is to ensure that our Oregon health plan members experience coordinated and integrated care across health and social systems. Also, that there are no language, cultural, or economic barriers to care, and that OHP enrollment is preserved as people transition between systems. We know that there are big disruptions in certain transitions, like movement from out of Oregon State Hospital to community, or other psych or substance use disorder residential facilities, kids who are leaving foster care either because they go home to their parents or because they age out, transitions for people who are homeless and find a stable place. So I'll be highlighting some of those transitions, but really thinking about those members, and because they traditionally haven't had this great integration across the system and preserving their OHP coverage. And so they end up back in an emergency room or end up back in the same facility where they started. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. Next slide. And we're trying to solve this basic issue that our health system is complicated, and it's particularly complicated and hard to navigate in times of transition. And so changes in life phases, changes in settings or systems just make it even harder to navigate. So I'm going to talk about a few of the big transitions, and then what we plan to do about that in each of them, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So next slide. So one of the areas where we know across the state there are big issues is on housing. We have many OHP members are experiencing difficult transitions due to housing insecurity or homelessness. And so in all of these transitions, what we are doing is asking about coverage, asking the federal government about coverage, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but also developing kind of a package of services for each of these transitions that address, in many cases, social needs. So for homeless, if a member is identified as being housing insecure or homeless, then they would, just by being in that state of transition, qualify for a particular set of services. Those services would be kind of a housing bundle that could include first and last month's rent, that it could include furniture and moving services, tenancy sustaining services, and in some cases, potentially employment services. So getting people into a stable place. We can't pay to build housing, but we can do lots of things with Medicaid dollars. And this is where we will be pushing the federal government on what can we pay for. That what we know that when folks have a stable place to live, particularly people who have mental health issues or people who are dual eligible, that they don't go back to the emergency room. Their actual medical spend starts to go down. So this is an area that we can provide more stability, provide some social needs, and save the federal government some money. Next slide. Another big area is people who are encountering the criminal justice system. So I don't know if everyone's aware, but when a person right now, when a person enters a jail or a prison or Oregon Youth Authority, their coverage stops. And so Medicaid coverage is suspended, and the correction facility takes over. And then until the second the person walks out the door, there isn't a seamless transition. So when a person walks into a jail, and if they have a mental illness, the jail medical staff has no idea about medications they're on, who their doctor is, any underlying chronic conditions. And on the other end, when a person walks out the door, they have no meds. Takes a while to get their OHP coverage back, and don't often even have a place to live. So we are going to be asking the federal government for coverage, a certain level of Medicaid coverage, one that happens at the front end when you first enter for a certain period of time until at least they're adjudicated. And then at the end, probably it will be 90 days before they are released, so that they can engage with a peer support specialist or a traditional health worker, some navigator, so they'd be eligible for navigation services, and then also eligible for a bundle of services that would include these housing supports and services, potentially employment, medication, so that they go and leave the facility with a full month of medication until they're established, even start making doctor's visits and mental health visits that they need. So that's the ask on the criminal justice side. The next, and I will say, coverage during incarceration. So far, federal government hasn't supported that. We think that by having it be a seamless transition kind of coverage that is limited, that we have a good shot at getting that piece covered. Also, this is also true if we go to the next slide for people in state hospital or in adult mental health residential facilities right now, for example, are not part of their CCO coverage. So there are cases where, they lose coverage, and it's very similar to what happens when someone leaves criminal justice. So again, if a person is in the state hospital, we will be asking for some coverage before they leave, 90 days before they leave, for the same kinds of services that we identify for those folks that are leaving the criminal justice system. And then next slide, kids in foster care. Also, what we've decided to do is really think about children as a group. And so kids in foster care, kids in the Oregon Youth Authority, kids in county detention centers, all of them experience big transitions. They lose their coverage, it can come back, or they may, in foster care, they're in one CCO and then they often have to move back to their home CCO. So again, providing culturally responsive navigation services to the child and family, and then providing, services to family if they need housing supports. In some cases, parents may need extra support around substance use disorder or mental illness, affordable childcare services. So, it's a combination of some kind of what we think of as traditional medical services, but also services to meet social need. Right now, we're in the process of, identifying if there are any other important transitions. I know John Santa mentioned, for example, we're looking at, older adults that transition from Medicaid to Medicare. There are some other transitions that, that we're taking a look at that may get added, but these are the big ones. Next slide. So now we have some time for questions and feedback. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Chair Bingsberg.
Okay, great. Questions, comments from the board over either this section or the entire presentation? John?
Yeah, I'll be honest, every time I look at a slide and it has OHA's goal to eliminate equity issues by 2030, not reduce them, eliminate them, I just like wince. But I think what you've talked about today could get you pretty close. I think this is really exciting stuff, risky stuff. Power and wealth is going to be so tough, but good for you guys that you are reaching. Thank you.
Ebony, you had a comment, a question?
I really appreciated kind of, how you're looking at it in the various subgroups. And the one question that I do have that I didn't catch, and maybe it's included, but thinking about children and youth, are y'all also considering youth who are kind of transitioning into the IDD realm also? Because I know that that's a big kind of, there's a lot of challenges between behavioral health and IDD when it comes to children and youth and that whole kind of transition and coordination.
We have been looking at youth transition, both I think in two areas. One is, thinking about services for kids, particularly those who have identified, as having special needs as they transition from pediatrics to adult kinds of care, but also looking at some coverage extension, and that's over in the coverage side. So I didn't cover it, but, thinking about, covering kids longer than 18 for their behavioral health benefit, for example, because we know that it gets really hard once they hit 18, they kind of often can fall off a cliff. They lose their coverage. So yeah, thanks for calling that out.
Other comments or questions? One thought I had is, Lori, I think your presentation, especially Xenia and Annie's presentation, really addresses some of the concerns raised by the Health Equity Committee. And I think, it'd be important for us to update that committee on this thinking, because I think they'll be very pleased with this progress.
Great, thank you. Yes, I think we should. That'd be great. And hopefully we can get Xenia and Annie to help with that. Really appreciate that.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you for a thumbs up, Annie.
If there aren't any, I want to thank everyone for having us here to present this month.
Thank you very much. A really important topic. Very productive meeting. We're coming to the end. Would like to remind everyone listening that there's going to be an Oregon Health Policy Board educational webinar on October 17th at 8 a.m. About the healthcare workforce equity framework. So look forward to hearing that webinar and sharing it with you all. Our next Oregon Health Policy Board meeting will be Tuesday, September 7th, which is right after Labor Day. Look forward to seeing you all there. Again, thanks for the great work of everyone at OHA and membership of the Oregon Health Policy Board. Great work. I look forward to seeing you after Labor Day. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.